Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Nonprofit Finance Forum. We'll be beginning right at the top of the hour, but welcome. Thank you for being here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's much better, Alicia.
Okay, 1 second. You said it sounds better, David?
Yes, your audio is very good now.
Okay, perfect.
So welcome everyone who's just joined. We'll be starting right at the top of the hour. It's like we always say in church, I don't care if they start on time as long as they end on time. All right, well, welcome everyone. On behalf of my colleagues and all the speakers, I want to warmly welcome all of you to our second annual Nonprofit Finance Forum. Whether your organization is at the very beginning of its life cycle or is very experienced and mature as a nonprofit organization, there will be things that you will benefit from in today's program. We're very excited to share this material with you. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, the many organizations that worked very hard behind the scenes to pull this together. And each of these sponsors actually has a speaker on the program, so you'll get a chance to become familiar with each one of them. We've gathered a group of real subject matter experts today. The accounting profession, like many other fields, has generalists and specialists. Of course, a generalist knows a little bit about a lot of things, whereas a specialist focuses on something very narrow and becomes a very deep expert on that specific aspect. And that's what you're going to hear from today. People who have not only made nonprofits the focus of their careers, but a very specific aspect of that, whether it's audit or legal or state, local or international issues. You're really going to hear from people who are the best of the best in this field. And many of them are actually nationally recognized, speaking at national and state societies and conferences across the United States. So I think you're going to be very pleased with the presenters we have today. We've got a very ambitious agenda. The topics here are all designed specifically for nonprofit organizations. And the goal in this symposium, obviously, is not to go into great detail of every single aspect of these topics. Our hope today is that you may not walk out of here with all the answers, but hopefully you'll walk out with a better understanding of the questions, maybe thinking about things you hadn't thought of before, weren't even aware of. And so our goal today is to really see how some of these topics can affect your organization, maybe in ways that you hadn't already anticipated. As a reminder, there will be 4 hours of CPE credit available. However, to get it, there's always a catch, right? To get it, you have to respond to the polling questions that will appear periodically. This is a NASBA requirement, and they require that credit be withheld if the participant does not respond to the polling questions. So you do have to pay some attention. Those polling questions will pop up, and the speakers may even draw attention to them, but be sure to respond to those so that we can give you your CPE certificate at the end. So now we'll turn it over to our first speaker, Michael Cohen of Suitless, and he's going to speak to us on the topic remote back office. Michael, go ahead.
Great, thank you, David. Appreciate it. It's nice to be here. Wanted to, guess we give a little bit of background. We can move to the first slide, and I can start by giving a background on who we are, what we do, why is this important, and the types of organizations that we work with. So real quick, Suitless is essentially a remote back office firm. We provide small to medium-sized organizations with HR, finance, and what we call e-office support. Now, most of you have probably experienced some of the things that have been going on over the past year with COVID and the pandemic and the shift to remote and virtual. So I know a lot of the speakers here today are going to be talking about that, but I think this is a really good opportunity for me, for us, for me to talk about sort of the trends that are involved in remote back office and virtual work, specifically focusing on some of the systems, some of the HR systems and payroll systems and bookkeeping systems and that type of thing. And what's interesting about this and sort of working with all of the folks that you'll be listening to, the other presenters today, is that we work with a lot of these folks. We work as part of our job and part of what we do. We engage with auditors and lawyers and compliance specialists and grants management professionals. So this is actually a really good place to start. That's why I mentioned that why is it important? Because administration and office work are really the foundation, the underpinnings of everything that you're going to talk about and learn about today. And I wanted to make a point here about stages of organizational growth. I know that folks here are with nonprofit organizations of all shapes and sizes, from small to medium to large. And so this remote back office discussion, this presentation, is really for all types of organizations. Whenever I talk about and give this presentation, I talk about pulling people and organizations into the future and using tools of the future and thinking about ways of doing things that are current and looking forward. I do want to make one disclaimer, actually two disclaimers. One, nothing that I say today here is any sort of legal, tax, or insurance advice. And also, we are not compensated by any of the vendors that we mentioned. We may mention software systems. I may mention software systems, or I may mention vendors or that type of thing. And in the event that I do, we aren't compensated. We don't make money if you check these vendors out. We're just mentioning them because we like them, we use them. That's what we've found to be effective. So that's the first quick version of who we are, what we do, why this is important, and just very, very excited to be here with a great group of professionals. So we can kick this off. So really want to start with like a history of back office and what I mean by back office. So back office is really the folks that are not forward facing in your organization. So they are not the membership folks or the sales folks or marketing or communications. They are the people that are doing sort of the quote unquote back office work. So anything related to human resources, dealing with internal employees, anything related to payroll, accounting, bookkeeping, office management, sort of the folks in the past that have always kept the trains running on time and that sort of thing. So that's what I mean by back office. And what that's always been like is a lot of we may call paper pushing, right? The history of back office is sort of having people sign documents and sign off on things and meet in person. And that's the history, but we also have to look at the future of things. Where's everything going, right? And a perfect example that I like to give here is the evolution of paper to PDFs to systems and e-signatures and that sort of thing. When we talk about what back office in the next generation looks like, we're actually seeing it. And I gave a similar presentation about 6 months ago and one 6 months before that. And what's so interesting is that people are starting to get it. They're starting to get the next generation of back office. And I think what it looks like in terms of back office professionals and what they're doing is, and what you would want to find in a back office professional is someone who has technical expertise, right? Someone who understands the back office work, the bookkeeping, the finance, the HR, the office management. Someone who has the technological expertise, so they can actually maneuver within the systems, various systems that are needed in order to capitalize on being a back office professional. And then finally, the soft skills that are required. So actually being able to interact with the lawyers, the accountants, the external professionals, and even the internal, other employees and other people within the organization. I think that these three areas are huge, and we work with a lot of companies that are growing, a lot of nonprofits that are growing and hiring, and we really try to help them drill down on these three areas, especially when it comes to being able to succeed in the back office. Again, the technical expertise, being able to do your job, do it well, knowing your subject matter, knowing your area, whether if that's in HR, that's the benefits or the payroll or the employee relations, whether it's on the finance side, understanding your accounting systems and your reporting and timing and tax and that sort of thing. And then on the technology side, we see this a lot where folks have been in the industry a long time. They may have the technical, the subject matter expertise. They may have great soft skills, but they're not as familiar with how to really use a computer or stack multiple systems on top of each other to help succeed. So again, when you're looking for back office professionals to help support your organization, look for these key elements when you're talking to them and drill down on these three areas. We can move on to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about HR and finance trends. And I started off with virtual, of course, right? We're living in a virtual environment. There is talk of this hybrid environment, and then almost the pre-COVID discussion was around in person, right? And so these three areas seem to constantly be a balancing act. We're seeing a lot more organizations choose to go entirely virtual. So there are risks and rewards that come with that. And as we continue to talk with organizations, we're starting to see what more of those risks and rewards are. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But next up, we included something that said, what's your stack, right? And so there's a lot of different systems out there that we use as organizations in order to do our job and augment or even supplement the work that back office professionals are doing. So, for example, your stack may include email, it may include Slack, it may include text messaging, it may include chat. I said Slack, but it could include something like Google Chat as well. It could also include payroll systems, which are now increasingly being shifted to the cloud. So cloud-based payroll systems like ADP, Paychex, Gusto is a new one. Betty is a new one. So they're constantly being sort of updated and available in the cloud. Very different than how it used to be, where organizations would run everything from a desktop computer and then have multiple systems and that sort of thing. Bookkeeping systems, we're seeing a massive transition to the cloud as well. From the sort of legacy QuickBooks desktop system to QuickBooks Online, Xero, Wave. There's a whole bunch of new accounting systems and bookkeeping systems that are out there that actually exist entirely in the cloud. So one thing I will say about these cloud-based systems is it actually creates new challenges for organizations, right? So now maybe you can access your cloud-based bookkeeping or payroll system from anywhere. But what does that mean? Are you having remote professionals log in to help you? Are they employees? Are they contractors? One of the big things that we've discovered can be a challenge when it comes to these systems is password management. So using a system like 1Password or LastPass, where you can actually store your passwords in an encrypted system and delegate them and withdraw authorization as you need to, is critical. So I think thinking through, not just saying like, hey, we need a cloud-based system to manage something, but also thinking through from end to end on how you're going to manage it, how you're going to delegate the passwords and access to people, where you're going to store instructions or training on how to use those systems. Are you going to allow, certain people, contractors or employees to use those systems, that sort of thing. We also said HR systems in here as well. I think HR systems are starting to become or go hand in hand with payroll systems and eventually possibly bookkeeping systems as well. QuickBooks Online sort of does have some operability in those areas, but we're starting to see more companies like Bamboo HR and Kin HR and even Gusto and Rippling that are these all-in-one HR systems where 10, 20 years ago you used to have to purchase a standalone system, you'd have to buy licenses, you'd have to install it on your server, you'd have to have someone come out and make updates to it. And so that still exists, and it still exists for a lot of large organizations, but the beauty of cloud-based systems is that they can scale down whether you have 1 or 2 employees all the way up to if you have 100 employees. And as long as you are familiar with using them, they don't have a huge setup time. There's not a huge onboarding process. These lightweight systems tend to be easy to roll out, and I think it gives a lot of nonprofits and organizations in general the ability to be more flexible and have more tools and resources at their fingertips. I'll also talk a little bit about administrative systems. Administrative systems are systems that help sort of underpin all of these systems. You may be familiar with a system like SharePoint or another system like Trainual or another one like Loom. These are systems that allow you to store and manage documents in the cloud. So, for example, one administrative system that we like to use, and I'll give multiple examples, is OneDrive, Box, and Dropbox. So these are 3 systems that are cloud-based that allow you to store documents, PDFs, files, and they allow you to store them across your organization. So, our organization has been virtual for almost 5 years, and instead of ever having a file cabinet with documents and so forth, we keep everything in the cloud. 99% of the documents that we have are based in the cloud. I will say another administrative system that we're seeing more use with is add-ons to Google Mail and Outlook Mail. So really, those are core email systems, but being able to layer tools on top of that has become sort of a mainstay when it comes to people working in the new remote environment. So a couple of examples. I know that a number of organizations use mail tracking features, especially for marketing campaigns. So mailtrack.io might be one example. Another one would be Gemelius. There are a few of them out there that basically allow you to track your campaigns. They allow you to track if you're sending out solicitations or talking to donors and seeing if they've accessed their mail, their email. And then another system that we're seeing more use with is virtual support box inboxes. So actually creating a department inbox and then being able to assign mail from that department into other individual inboxes. A good use case that we're seeing, a good organization that we're seeing that we really like is an organization called Hiver, Hiver, and this allows you to set up multiple inboxes. So you may have a communications at your nonprofit or communication membership at your nonprofit, and emails that go into that inbox can be delegated and visualized by the entire communications team or the entire membership team. And I think the beauty of this is it cuts down on having to have someone constantly forwarding emails and replying to emails, and who replied to this one and who replied to that one. So, and another layer that's now being added on to this type of email software is AI. So we're seeing artificial intelligence being able to automatically route emails that come into a general inbox to the right person. So if you have one person that works on specifically, say, the financial component of membership versus another one who works totally on interacting with members, they would have emails sent to the primary general inbox that go to each one of them. So again, all of these are systems that your organization can use that are software as a service, meaning you pay for them on a monthly basis based on the number of users, that can almost enhance the work that back office professionals are doing. And so I would say if you are having challenges in this space, you can't figure out how to get something done, or you have recurring tasks that need to get done, or if something is really, you're having a specific challenge that's taking up a lot of time, think how your stack may be able to support it. It may not be only an employee issue. It may not be only a human issue. It could be a human plus technology issue that can be solved through a couple of lightweight systems. A perfect example of this is we spoke with a CFO recently of a small nonprofit who is spending a lot of their time mailing out checks to contractors and making invoice and vendor payments and trying to collect W-9s and the whole 9 yards. And they realized that if they combined some templatized emails with their cloud-based payment software, incidentally, they were using a system called Bill.com, they were able to process payments in batches at a cheaper rate than what they were previously paying, and for less person power than they were doing before. So again, I would say if you're experiencing challenges in the person power and manpower area, man or woman power area, think about what systems and technology you can use in order to help supplement you. Great. So it looks like we have a poll, and I'll give everyone a minute to answer that before we move forward. All right. So I talked a little bit about payroll and bookkeeping systems already. The beauty of a lot of these systems that are employee facing or external stakeholder facing is that they're self-service. So whereas one organization might be out there sending emails out and sending forms out and having people sign them and mail them back, other organizations may be sending out just a link saying, hey, complete your documentation, input your bank account information, and we'll get you paid. And so if organization A takes 5 hours every month to do that operation, and organization B takes half an hour each month, it's not hard to see who's going to be more successful in the long run, because they're saving time, they're saving money, they're making it easier for their vendors or external stakeholders to get things done. We talked a little bit about cloud-based services already, but these are services that you can flip on just like a light switch. You can sign up for them, you can put your credit card on file, you can pay on a monthly basis, and cloud-based services are amazing, especially when you stack them on top of each other. We talked a little bit about stacks in the previous slide, but being able to stack these cloud-based services on top of each other and ultimately having a competent human managing the process can actually believe it or not, take the place of, you know, multiple people. Now, one of the questions that we always get is, well, hey, look, you know, we don't want to replace our people with machines, right? And that's not the idea here. What we're saying is use the word supplement, use the word augment. How do we make people more efficient by using technology without the idea of replacing them, right? I know that's big in the news right now. You know, jobs are going away, people are being replaced. That's not the message that we want to send here. The message we want to send is, let's make our people more effective. Let's make them their jobs more streamlined. Let's make them better at what they do and more competent. I put something in here that said electronic payments first. I do want to mention that I think this is the direction that we're going, and that I think that the world is going. Processing electronic payments, paying vendors electronically, doing all of those actions is exactly where we're headed. I think checks and petty cash and those ways of paying, they will always be around, but electronic payment is here, and it's here to stay. Same with payroll, same with payments. We're seeing all sorts of innovative methods when it comes to payroll, in terms of people being paid, being able to really drive their own payroll. So if you're, you know, net payment each pay cycle is a certain dollar amount, to be able to be paid on a more frequent basis, or to elect, you know, all driven by policy. You know, if you want to be paid to certain accounts, or make certain donations, or that sort of thing, all of these things are becoming much easier for smaller organizations to tackle. And I will say one other thing: a lot of these actions have been around forever, but I think that the beauty of what's going on now in terms of technology is that it's becoming accessible to organizations that are smaller, that don't have a huge back office, that don't have a ton of resources, people that don't have a ton of time. So I think that that's going to end up driving competition, and I think that'll ultimately be a good thing in the long run. We can head on to the next slide. HR administrative services, we touched on this again before. Cloud-based service, again, I cannot stress the importance of cloud-based services and using them for back office. Record keeping is critical. We talked a little bit earlier about systems like Dropbox and Box and OneDrive and Google Drive, and storing your files online, but also the use of e-signature systems by human resources and back office and finance professionals is becoming critical, and they're becoming super lightweight and super easy. If you're not familiar with e-signature, I encourage you to look into it some more. Some folks may have used e-signature, but they're not sure how to use e-signature themselves. I would encourage anyone here to check out some of the systems. A few examples are EchoSign, DocuSign, PandaDocs, HelloSign. There's a bunch out there, and they all have different sorts of functionalities, but these are legally binding signature systems that your organization can use, and you can use it for all sorts of things. You know, whether it's signing corporate documents, to signing agreements, putting you know, employee documentation in place, and so forth. I included something in here about from emails to systems. We're really seeing the advent of the ability to move beyond just email. And not only is it just email in terms of communicating and sending messages back and forth, but also capturing data and capturing information. There's a ton of systems out there. You know, some folks may be familiar with things like Typeform, Jotform, Google Forms, but these are forms that your company can create that allows people, whether they're internal or external, to actually submit information to you. You can capture that information and then manipulate that data. So for example, you may be able to put a survey out to your entire organization, capture that data, and collect that data and present that data. Next, I'm going to move on to compliance. We're seeing more trends towards compliance as a service. So this is anything from state compliance, like labor and notices and posters that employees in various locations are required to receive. Also, internal compliance like HR employee handbooks. We're seeing them now being distributed entirely via PDF. Some organizations are using even more advanced systems like Notion, the Notion and Rome. So Notion and Rome are both the equivalent of internal wikis that you can create relatively easily. If you haven't heard of those systems before, I'd encourage you to check them out. They're kind of what to organizations what SharePoint was 10, 15 years ago. They're very lightweight. They allow you to create an internal Wikipedia with all sorts of embedded media pretty quickly, where you can roll out an employee handbook to any new person that comes on board. They can read what you've written. You can record video messages, audio messages as part of your handbook or as part of your training guides. And then you can send, you can even send an acknowledgement that they've viewed and received those items electronically. So again, all of these things that were done previously and historically with pen and paper are now being transitioned into the cloud and being done virtually. And lastly, insurance is going this way as well. Any sort of insurance requirements that organizations, especially nonprofits, have around business owners' policies and EPLI, directors and officers. I don't think insurance is touched on too much throughout this presentation, but everything is also trending online as well there. So everything from insurance applications to providing additional data, to submitting claims, to actually even interacting with your insurance brokers. So again, everything's trending remote, and it looks like that's the direction, and it's here to stay. So that's it for me. I appreciate everyone listening. I hope that there was some unique insights in there. And as David mentioned earlier, there's generalists and specialists. We happen to be generalists in the areas of HR and finance. But I hope you stick around and enjoy the rest of the day, and enjoy all the other presenters that are coming up. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great presentation with lots of useful information. We appreciate you and Suitless making that available to us. We'll now turn our attention to TrimnerBeckham of UProfit. She's going to discuss grants management, tricks to maximize your funding. Alicia?
Thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy that all of you have been able to join today, taking the valuable time out of your day to join us on this amazing webinar. So as David mentioned, I will be discussing grants management and the various ways that you can, as a nonprofit, maximize your funding. I am the founder of UProfit, and what we do at our organization is we focus primarily on grants management in various areas, such as developing cost allocation plans and indirect cost rate proposals. But the idea is really to be able to maximize your funding so that you as an organization can further carry out your services to create a greater impact in your communities. And so the three areas that I'd like to highlight today to maximize your funding is, first, understanding your full cost of service. So that's identifying your direct and indirect costs. The second is an indirect cost rate, and how developing an indirect cost rate is extremely valuable to your organization to understand in any areas that you might be subsidizing costs, as well as how to use that rate to really capture your full cost of service. And then lastly, how you can use the federal regulations, the 2 CFR, to be able to maximize your funding even further. So we can go to the next slide. Yes. So the first step is understanding your full cost of service. And so to piggyback off of what Michael was talking about, really capturing all of your costs from an accounting aspect is going to be super, super important. And so we will go into organizations and work with the organization to ensure that they have the proper accounting processes in place to make sure that they are allocating their costs properly, that they have accounted for everything accordingly. and that they're capturing all of their cost in the different grant buckets, and they're not commingling the funds. Once we've been able to identify from an accounting aspect, what are all of the costs that it takes for your organization to operate, one of the areas that we will do is prepare a cost allocation plan. And so a cost allocation plan can be prepared very, very simply, but essentially what it does is we identify the level of service that it takes for your organization to carry out a program. So as we all know, you might be going after funding, whether it's with local government, state, federal, foundations, various individuals, but if you don't have a strategy to know what that full cost looks like, so if program A, we're understanding, okay, well, it's going to take program A to carry out I don't know, planting trees or something like that. And we have 5 people that's going to lead that program, and we might have some volunteers, there might be some travel, transportation, so on and so forth, various supplies like getting trees. And so, okay, we understand the direct cost. That's a direct cost pertaining to that particular program. Oftentimes what organizations will miss out on is the indirect portion, and the indirect portion is going to be costs such as finance to be able to process all of the bills associated with purchasing the supplies and services to actually plant those plants, the hiring, so HR to hire all of the personnel to carry out these services, as well as find all of the volunteers. And so there's a level of indirect cost that is often missed, and more often than not, it is missed when identifying the true cost of service to carry out these programs. And so if an organization is going after grant funding, or they are trying to set up fundraisers to have these funds to be able to carry out these programs, if they're not understanding their full cost of service, which is going to include their indirect and direct costs, that means that they are subsidizing to some degree. And if you are always subsidizing, then you're going to be in a continuous loop of always missing out on funding. And so obviously without any program, you always have to have finance, HR, IT, the level of support programs to actually carry out those other programs. And so we are able to identify those full cost of services through various metrics, identifying allocation metrics, whether it's number of FTEs or number of transactions, to really identify the level of support that these support programs such as finance and HR are providing to the actual programs that are carrying out the services. As you can see in this little chart that is provided by the Nonprofit Finance Fund, this is basically identifying the level of support from an indirect cost perspective that each of these areas will actually fund or not fund the indirect portion of costs. This has been just to give you a little bit of background, I come from government. I used to work for the state of California. I used to audit cities and counties throughout the state to ensure that they were in compliance with the cost allocation plan and indirect cost rate, which is another topic that we're going to discuss. But I would ensure that they were in compliance with it within the federal regulations to ensure that they were allocating their costs out appropriately. Through that process, there has been various iterations of the regulations to ensure that organizations can recover their costs the way that they can, that is allowable and per the regulations, but then also identifies the various ways that they can go about that. And one of those ways is developing a cost allocation plan. And so in this chart, it identifies basically if a nonprofit's receiving funding from a local government, they are only at 4%, they're always funding the indirect portion. And you can see 52% of local government is not providing that funding. Well, per the federal regulations, and we'll get more into this, they're actually obligated to recover and fully reimburse organizations such as nonprofits their full cost of service. And as I was mentioning, there's multiple iterations of these regulations, and everyone kind of has to get on board. It's a kind of a slow process, but there's a lot of discussions about nonprofits being able to recover their full cost of service. And so as you can see here just in this graph, it is still very uncommon for nonprofits to receive their full cost of service. And as you know, nonprofits are the ones that are really directly impacting our communities. And this is where a lot of my passion resides, is being able to help the nonprofits, one, be educated, but then also two, really ensure that they're set up for success so that they can carry out their mission and positively impact more lives within our communities. And within the regulations, they basically have taken 8 different circulars. So there was a nonprofit circular, there was a university, the state and local government. So they combined 8 different circulars to be all in an umbrella of one, which is the 2 CFR 200, which allows those organizations to follow under the same guidelines. There are some nuances where, you know, certain types of costs are not allowable based off of your organization. However, everyone, in terms of what is allowable and not allowable, and the various reports and aspects that you can utilize as a benefit to your organization, everyone follows those same guidelines. And one of those is developing a cost allocation plan. And so knowing that on average, these are the rates that nonprofit organizations are actually receiving their full cost of support, you can better prepare yourselves, such as developing a cost allocation plan and an indirect cost rate proposal, so that you can have this as documentation, not only for internal purposes, but also when you're seeking out grant funding, as well as including it in your proposals to justify your costs. So these are reports that are used to actually justify your level of support for your direct programs. And so if we actually go, yeah, thank you. Okay, so here's a quick poll. I don't know if this was meant to go now or in the slide after, but if you guys can take a quick poll, do you currently receive any grant funding? Thank you. So I also wanted to mention that identifying your full cost of service is not only for the purposes of obtaining grant funding, but it's also it's used internally for the purposes of just simply understanding your full cost of service. So if you understand, okay, from a direct perspective and an indirect perspective, how much is actually costing you, then you can identify any areas that you might be subsidizing, and then you can make the strategic decisions moving forward to say, hey, you know what, we need to create a new fundraiser. We need to tackle and go after more foundations for unrestricted funding. Restricted funding is like the gold, right? You don't want to have to identify like how you're using that funding. You want to be able to utilize it in what's going to benefit your organization the most. And so having these reports, and even from a very, you know, basic level of putting it on a spreadsheet, is super, super important so that you as an organization can make the decisions necessary to help your organization grow and impact more lives. Because at the end of the day, that's what you guys are all trying to accomplish, is really serving the communities and impacting and further carrying out your mission. And so once basically you have identified your true cost of service, you've either developed a cost allocation plan in accordance with the federal regulations, the next step would be creating an indirect cost rate proposal. A lot of my clientele is state and local government. They're very familiar with these reports. Actually, all counties within the US actually has to create a cost allocation plan. In addition to, most will actually create an indirect cost rate proposal. So these reports are actually not as common to be prepared in nonprofit organizations because they were not under the same regulatory guidelines as state and local government. So now that nonprofits are under the same guidelines, this is actually a benefit to the organizations. Unless you were receiving at least $11 million in direct federal funding, your organization wasn't required to prepare a cost allocation plan and an indirect cost rate proposal. These two aspects, a cost plan and an indirect cost rate proposal, With a lot of nonprofit organizations, you do not have to create both of those to achieve the same results. It depends on the complexity of your organization and the structure of your organization to really identify, okay, do we want to go in depth and have a robust report as a cost allocation plan, or can we create just an indirect cost rate? And that's actually what I do a lot of times with nonprofits, just because of the size of their organization. However, it still accomplishes the same goal. And identifying an indirect cost rate, it's basically indirect cost divided by your direct costs, and you get a rate. And so what this does, again, is it really identifies how much it's costing you to operate your organization. So for example, your indirect cost rate ends up being 20%. That's saying for every dollar, 20 cents is attributed to overhead costs. And there's this huge thing about, oh, well, my rate's really high and funders are not going to fund me if I have a really high rate. And that is still something within this space that is being tackled upon because a lot of it's having to educate the funders as well as to the regulations. And I'll give you a short little story. I was attending a conference in DC one time, especially after the regulations got changed, but I was in a room full of federal agencies, state and local government, and I was the only consultant. And we were going over the regulations and we got to indirect costs. This is, I don't know what it is, but it's a super sensitive topic for a lot of people. But once we got to that topic, everyone kind of like sighed and they're like, oh. And so I'm like, can I ask a question? What was it about, what is it about indirect costs that you guys all kind of had that response? And a lot of people said, well, we just don't have the resources to understand it or learn about it. We don't have the proper education. There's all sorts of reasons why they do not like talking about indirect costs. If you think about that, and you are submitting a grant, or if you're in the process of thinking about obtaining grant funding and you have a funder who doesn't understand indirect costs to begin with, imagine how challenging it is for organizations to be able to obtain their full cost of service. And so this has been a mission for several years of getting everyone on the same board, and you can easily Google things like full cost of service for nonprofits, and it's a very hot topic. But essentially, it starts from the funders level, truly, of them not really being educated in this particular space of indirect costs, and understanding how it's important for organizations to recover their full cost of service. And so what happens is that they get into this loop. So a nonprofit gets accepted these fundings, and which are not fully being recovered. So they might be being reimbursed for their direct costs, but they're not getting reimbursed for their indirect costs. And so what happens is that they're not able to fully achieve the results that's been set out within the grant. And then that means that they're not able to fully deliver the services to the communities. And then that means that the expectations aren't being fully met by the funders. And then the funders will lose trust and tighten up the restrictions. And then it's just this vicious cycle that keeps happening. And so what I do with my clients is that I also will be a liaison to the funders, help them become educated on the regulations, and it's more of working together to accomplish. At the end of the day, there's one goal, and we all want to accomplish that one goal, which is providing the services set forth in that grant proposal. And so by establishing a lot of these proposals, reports such as a cost allocation plan and indirect cost rate, it really strengthens, one, your organization internally, because then you're able to make those strategic decisions as to the areas that you might be subsidizing, but it's also a way to budget properly and then also be able to recover those funds. So if you're only recovering say you get a grant for $100,000 and it's actually costing you $150,000, how are you going to recover that extra $50,000? That cost it exists regardless of these direct costs. And so the idea is to recover this $50,000. Now this could be in terms of making strategic decisions, you can identify, if you don't understand your full cost of service and the overhead rate associated with carrying out those services, and you're going after a grant, say, well, we've gone through our analysis, we've developed a cost plan, we've identified an indirect cost rate. We know that program A, it cost us $150,000. Well, maybe you should be looking for grants that are at $150,000 and can recover your full cost of service. However, you're looking for just a $100,000 grant. Is that grant a grant that you want to take on? Because it's going to still cost you $150,000. So you might make the policy decisions to say, yes, I still want to go after this $100,000, but these are going to be the metrics or the ways that we're going to recover the $50,000, whether it's we're going to send out more mailers and notify people of more of our services, ask for more donations, go get more unrestricted funding, or fundraise more to be able to cover that cost. At least at the end of the day, you know where you might be subsidizing and how you can recover those costs if you're not able to recover it through your grant. And again, this does not have to just apply to obtaining grant funding. This can be utilized just for internal purposes, so that if you do go after funding, you know how much it's going to cost you to carry out certain services within your program. And we have another question. I would say, what is your most common grant funding that you receive?
While you all are answering that poll question, I want to draw your attention to the fact that you can also ask questions of your own. We have time reserved at the end to address any questions from the audience, so please feel free to type those in, and the organizers will see that the presenters are given the opportunity to respond.
Yes, ask questions. Thank you, David. Okay, so lastly, utilizing the regulations to our benefit. This is my favorite. It's my favorite because when I started working in government, actually really working in government, as I was mentioning, the auditor, and I use these regulations. It used to be 2 CFR 225, now it's 200. And I love using these regulations to help my clients and other organizations, because oftentimes people can look at regulations and it's like daunting or not enjoyable, but if you read it and you know how to use it to your advantage, you can win. And so the first topic that I'd like to go over is cost matching. Whether you've tried to go after grant funding or not, you might be familiar with having match costs. And so that means that say you go after a grant that's $100,000 and they require you to basically have some skin in the game. So they're going to require you to say put 10% match. You have to match 10%, so that's going to be $10,000. A lot of times organizations will go to their unrestricted funding bucket, they'll go fundraise, they'll get the money from somewhere to match their $100,000 that they're going to get from the funder. Well, instead of having to tap into those funds that you can be utilizing better elsewhere, by having an indirect cost rate proposal that's been negotiated by a funding agency, you can actually use that rate as part of your match. That means that frees up that $10,000 that you would have had to otherwise allocate to this particular grant. And so by utilizing these services such as grant matching, so let's just say your indirect cost rate was 20%. We'll just use the 20% like I mentioned before. Okay, well 10% of it can be used as match. That still frees you up an additional 10% that you can recover on your indirect costs. And so this is a great way where utilizing the regulations to your benefit is extremely, extremely helpful. So that's cost matching. And again, utilizing the cost allocation plan, like I mentioned, this is a tool that is approved by the federal regulations, and it is in accordance with GAAP. So you have to make sure your financials are in line. There's a lot of reconciliation to audited reports. And so there are a lot of metrics that have to be utilized to ensure that it's in compliance with the federal regulations. And once that cost allocation plan is approved, you're able to then utilize that report when obtaining funding to be able to capture and recover your indirect costs. costs. And through that process is that next step of creating an indirect cost rate proposal, which is also in accordance with the federal regulations. And it basically there's like different appendices that outlines each of these areas, the cost plan and the indirect cost rate proposal, of how to essentially, at a very high level, essentially how to prepare these reports, what's included, what you can't include, the different certification pages that you will need to make sure that is provided to the funder for approval when they're going through their audit of this data. But utilizing the cost matchings, first you'll need an approved indirect cost rate proposal to be able to utilize that cost match, but then also preparing these reports, not only, as I mentioned, not only for grant reimbursement or obtaining grants, but really as an internal strategic management report, so that you as an organization can better can make more strategic decisions within your organization. And if you are not understanding your full cost of service, this is really the way that you're able to prevent crises and interrupted services when crises occur. If you are understanding your full cost of service, you'll know how to pivot in these times. So thank you again, everyone, for your time. If you have any questions, I welcome them. I love helping to educate, so please ask any questions that you might have, even if you don't have any grant funding on how to maybe go about that process. I'd love to answer any questions that you guys might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. That was great. Really enjoyed that. We did have one question come in, so we'll save that for the roundtable section, so stay tuned.
Perfect.
In the meantime, let's go ahead and turn our attention to Jeff Schrag, the founder of Newton Grange Consulting. He's going to discuss corporate governance, 7 tips to improve your organization's health. Jeff, go ahead. And I can't hear you, Jeff. I don't know if everybody else can.
Sorry, I forgot to turn the mic on. Typical.
All right, that's great. Thanks.
That's, someone has to make the first boo-boo. So thank you everyone for coming, and David for putting this excellent program together with all the different speakers and subject matter experts. It's a great way to get a lot of good CPE across many range of topics perspective. So yeah, my name is Jeff Schrag. I founded my own firm, Newton Grange Consulting, 3 years ago, and I practice consulting with organizations and CEOs of companies, both nonprofit and for-profit, in many different areas, and including alternative practice structure, where I actually provide legal services through a law firm, Keller and Kershaw. So I can both provide legal and consulting services depending on the engagement for the client perspective. Our goal today is to talk about corporate governance and for not-for-profit organizations. So David, I don't know if you want to just go to the first slide. And when you start talking about governance, it's really how does the organization operate? So this is an operational perspective. And to really have good governance, it really comes down to leadership, diversity of board members, making sure you've got people from all walks of life, different backgrounds, bringing those skill sets to the organization and making sure they're there and that they're willing to speak up and be transparent with each other, and having effective leaders that take feedback well, constructive criticism, and understand that it really takes a village to make an organization work well from governance and all of the other perspectives of how you accomplish your goals and missions. And then the bottom line is you need to be ethical. So once again, having good people have good ethics. They basically know what they're supposed to do, and they actually execute and do those things. They don't just put it off and say, oh yeah, no, someone else will do it. They actually will fill out their annual reports. They will, send the conflict of interest policies back. They actually follow through and making sure that things get done. And when there's an ethical issue, they actually raise it. They don't push it under the rug and say someone else will do it instead of me. I don't have to be the one to step up. Someone else will. So this comes down to good ethics. So David, let's go to the next one as we talk about good governance. These are kind of the 7 tips that I kind of have that basically help you with good governance. And the first one is use a consent agenda. And this is basically built around the idea that most organizations, when they run their meetings, they spend their time listening to reports and approving minutes and spending their time in the minutia versus stepping back and really thinking about an agenda that is about the organization's mission, purpose, and strategy. So the idea is to take those administrative items and move them to a consent agenda. So when the agenda for the meeting goes out, the consent agenda will have items on it like approve the minutes of the last meeting, accept the board reports. It may even have an action to actually have a motion to take some action that is not controversial. So in essence, it will be like to hire the audit firm potentially. Sometimes that's controversial, but we'll leave it at that. Hire the audit firm, re-engage legal counsel, things that are administrative that pretty much you know that it doesn't need to be discussed at this point, or it's basically maybe just to basically renew the contract under the terms from the prior year. So in essence, and the idea is when you do have a consent agenda, you need to make sure your chair understands what it means to have a consent agenda. Because I've seen people actually try to move to a consent agenda, and then the chair goes back and just treats everyone as a separate motion. It's just going to have a motion for the minutes, can I have a motion for receiving the reports. It's like, there is no motion when you use a consent agenda. What it is, it means the chair asks, is there any questions regarding the consent agenda? Is there anything on this agenda that we should move off of the consent agenda? And if someone says, no, I really do want to talk about retaining the auditors, and I'm just picking on auditors today since this is an audit type form, then it gets moved and becomes a place on the agenda. And then the chair will say, is there anything left? And then at that point, you don't even need a motion. It's just everything that's left on the consent agenda is deemed passed by the organization, in essence. And that's why you also need to make sure when you write the consent agenda, you actually write the items as approve the minutes, accept the reports. They need to be actions like motions. So that's what's happening. That is what you're doing through the consent agenda. So good organizations will use a consent agenda and actually then take the rest of their board meeting and look at strategic ideas. Where's the organization going? And sometimes I've even seen good organizations actually take part of their agenda and actually train board members or educate board members on some of the items that they're accomplishing. What are their outcomes? Looking at that perspective, it allows you to do that by using the consent agenda. The other item, number 2, is require all your board members to review the Form 990. And I mean review and read even though the 990 we think of it as a tax doc, all of the items in there because the document, and I know David has a presentation of what you should do. And the idea here is they're looking at the language, they're looking at what do we accomplish, and you can have people that are writers that take it a little bit differently and expound on accomplishments, outcomes, and what is the organization really doing versus just having numbers on a piece of paper. And they can give you valuable feedback if you have all your board members really spend some time reading and understanding the language of what's going into the 990. The third one is to hold executive sessions regularly. And once again, an executive session means it's just the voting members of the board. And even if the executive director may be a voting member of the board, you may still ask them to leave because you want to deal with personnel matters dealing with the executive director. And so due to conflicts, you would ask them to leave, and they may do a dual executive session with and without the executive director. And the idea here is when something comes up that you need an executive session, it doesn't look unusual that you went into an executive session. And the other issue I have is I have seen many board chairs will look around the room and, even though the executive sessions is on the session, say, does anybody have a problem not doing it? I don't think we have any problems right now. And of course, nobody raises their hand because they don't want to contradict the board chair saying there's nothing to talk about. However, even when people don't think there's anything to talk about, typically when they get into the executive session and start talking about things come up. They will mention something, and you really will have a discussion in the executive session that's more open and honest with each other, even though it may not have actually been required to be an executive session. But the board members, because of an executive session, actually engage better sometimes. And actually, it's a good practice in essence, do hold executive sessions either once every meeting or every other meeting, or at least once a quarter, so that your board is in the habit of having the executive session and people know, yes, it's going to happen. And yes, we may not have a specific reason to go in, but going into executive session does allow us to actually discuss, talk, and sometimes even get board members get to know each other better because they've actually communicated, not in the formal format of the actual meeting. So that's why I say it's good to have executive sessions and hold them regularly. The fourth one is board training. And once again, when you're bringing in new board members, you should have training for them, but you should invite the current board members in to talk about what does it mean to be a board member. Talk about duty of care. What does it mean to care for the organization? Duty of loyalty. What does the duty of loyalty mean to the organization? How can you be a loyal and effective board member through this training? And duty of fiduciary responsibility in terms of governance and making sure the organization is actually being compliant with all of its things. Hold that board training, teach them more about the organization in terms of how do you raise your money, where is the funding coming from, how does it get spent, give them a big picture of the organization and what that organization is accomplishing, and let them know what it really means to be a board member and how to be a part of the board. And also I usually include as part of that board training is new board members should have an ambassador or mentor to the board, depending on which kind of language you want to use, but someone that actually, takes them under the wing, makes sure that they understand the other board members, gives them a little bit of background, and actually is kind of like their mentor, ambassador as they come onto the board. The next one is enforce your term limits. So once again, good organizations rotate board members, and good organizations will also rotate executive directors. They will not be executive directors for life. Once again, one, and then you will actually have good feedback and making sure that you do have turnover and new ideas and things coming to the board perspective. So in essence, and once again, people will ask, what should your term limits be? You need to look at your organization. How hard is it for you to recruit new board members? Is it a 1-year process, 2-year process? Or are you like, the Met, everybody will sign up to want to be a board member because they want to go to the Met Gala every year, and they may just wear a regular tuxedo, but they do want to see Kim Kardashian. They do want to see all these other people in their outfits, so they're willing to pay the $200,000 to sign up. Once again, it's very easy for them to replace board members. But you may have an organization that you really need to work at finding new board members and getting them engaged in the organization. And actually, one organization I was involved recently, we had gone years trying to board more members and have been other board members recruit. And finally, interestingly enough, we finally just went out to a lot of the people we serve and sent out a general, hey, if you're interested in being on our board and helping us with diversity and helping us bring in younger people from different areas within the community, apply. And I was shocked. We had a number of applications, and we probably ended up replacing immediately 2 or 3 board members who are going to be term limited, and then actually now we have a pipeline of about 6 or 7 that are actually joining different committees of the board. So they will, one person with some fundraising background is joining the development committee. One person with some finance background is actually joining the finance committee as a consultant, because once again, you got some legal issues that they really can't be full members of the audit committee or finance committee. So they just got to be consultants. They can't have votes. So you got to make sure that your bylaws will cover that. But the idea was, yes, we decided we were going to enforce the term limits, and to do that, we had to get new board members, and this open call actually brought in a significant number of new board members from that perspective. The next one is review your bylaws periodically. So once a year, twice, once every other year, you should sit down, go through your bylaws, see what works, what doesn't work, you know, have you changed the name? That you no longer use executive director, you're now calling them the managing director, or you know, president, chair. Are your board terms 3 years? Maybe that's becoming tough. You want to do 4-year terms, maybe 2-year terms. Looking at things that help the organization be effective and nimble as an organization in terms of its governance, and going through also making sure you're up to date with any of the current changes in laws related to the organization where you need to change your bylaws. In terms of nomenclature, you know, once again, he, she, they, them, you know, the whole, you know, looking at your nomenclature within your bylaws and making sure they're more open and inclusive of terminology in terms of what's in there. And then my number one is strategically recruit new board members. To get new board members, good organizations spend time. And it really is a 2 to 3 year, sometimes 5-year process to bring on an effective and good board member. And then probably in year 7, 8 is when that person might actually become a chair or a treasurer or an officer type role within the organization as well, to make sure that that's happening and that they can actually be effective as new board members. So the good organizations find ways to recruit board members, and the governance committee will actually work at having a pipeline of potential board members. And so they will keep a sheet listing names, also listing areas of where we need individuals with specific skill sets. So if our board is missing someone with a certain background, we will say we need someone with this background, or in terms of, you know, gender, or in terms of race, or in terms of sexual awareness. We will be monitoring those things to make sure that we've got a good cross section of what the organization is looking for in terms of, you know, do we need someone with financial background because our treasurer is going to term off in a while? Do we need someone with investments because we have some investments, so we need someone to be on our investment committee that really understands how to monitor and deal with investments? Do we need someone that, you know, understands government grants? Because because we're getting so many government grants, we want someone that understands government grants, or we want someone with a legal background because we want them to, you know, hopefully look at our bylaws as part of their volunteer services in terms of making sure that's happening. So it's strategic, it's stepping back and looking forward as to what we want to accomplish in terms of our governance. So the idea here is, for improved governance, is stepping back and being periodic. It's really good hygiene for what the organization needs to do, and it's not just dental hygiene, you know, going into the dentist once a year. It really is thinking about your governance, stepping back and pruning what doesn't work, and then planning new ideas for the future to make sure those things are going to happen as well from those angles. So I'm probably a little ahead here, David. I don't know if you want to move ahead or you want to do something else, or I was talking a little too fast, or if anybody has any questions about governance and things they could do. But my goal is to say you need to think about your governance, and you really want to decide on a regular basis to use some methodologies to methodologies to make sure that you're really on task for all of your items in terms of, you know, the things you have to do every year, from bylaws to conflicts of interest, your whistleblower policy, and making sure those things are all up to date. And I call those more administrative, and we really need to work on a lot of the actual non-administrative stuff and then more of the strategic stuff in terms of governance. So I know
that was great material, Jeff. I think what we'll do now is pause for a poll question. Give everybody a moment to answer that.
All right. So the question here is, how likely is your organization to perform a review of its governance policies and procedures?
What should the answer be, Jeff?
Well, you should be highly likely. You really should be reviewing policies and procedures.
We try to design these poll questions so that there's no wrong answer, but I think this one probably does have a right answer.
There is no wrong answer. And
Well, we did have a couple questions come in during your session, but we'll go ahead and save those for the roundtable. So
Okay.
stick around and we'll share those at that point.
Okay.
I'll give you just another second on this poll. All right.
Yeah, no.
Well, moving right along, we're going to move to our next session, which is entitled Advocacy and Lobbying. I'm David Trimner. I'm the managing partner at TrimnerBeckham, and this is a topic that we have addressed at numerous conferences and symposiums all over the country, because it is something that a lot of nonprofit organizations want to learn more about. It's something they want to see if it makes sense to get more active in, but they certainly don't want to find themselves in any trouble for doing it. And I think we've all heard stories about nonprofit organizations that did cross some of those lines. There can be a reluctance sometimes with nonprofit organizations to get engaged in lobbying or anything even close to it. In some circles, it's considered a little bit distasteful, like, oh no, we would never do that. And so we try to overcome that perception with our clients a little bit, because lobbying can be a very important part of accomplishing the mission. You know, it goes back to that old saying that if you give a man a fish, you'll feed him for the day, but if you teach him how to fish, you'll feed him for a lifetime. And a lot of charities and other nonprofit organizations kind of get that. They want to help people who are in need, but they also want to help people kind of get out of the situation they're in and get their life back on track. Well, the lobbying part of that is making sure that the local regulatory body doesn't raise the price of a fishing license so high that people can't afford to get one, right? You're creating a legislative, a political climate that is conducive to accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish. And so I don't want anybody to dismiss lobbying as an activity that we would never consider, because that's just completely inappropriate. It is generally appropriate for nonprofit organizations to engage in lobbying, and we've listed some of the reasons here. It sparks not only the conversation about the issues that are important to you, but it can spark those conversations with the decision makers in the government, particularly the ones in the legislature that have the power and authority to pass or not pass laws that are important to you and to your mission. It gives people a voice in the process about something that they may be very passionate about. So it's recommended that all nonprofit organizations, particularly the 501c3 public charities, will look at their mission and not be too quick to discount how lobbying can be an important aspect of it. There is a caution here. You may need to consult your organizing documents, your articles, probably more likely your bylaws, to make sure there's nothing in there that prohibits lobbying. We have seen that from time to time, when they'll put something in there and says, we're just simply not going to do that. And of course, those organizational documents are a matter of state law. They are part of what you're required to live up to as part of your incorporation with the state. And so we would want to see organizations abide by that and not think, well, because the federal government might allow us to do this for tax purposes, we're going to ignore what conditions we put in our organizing documents that were filed with the state. So just a bit of a caution there. We should probably go ahead and define our terms, because people ask me all the time, you're telling me some of this I can do, some of this I can't do, some of it I can do a little, but don't do too much. So I really got to know where those lines are. So let's first talk about advocacy. And we're going to define these terms not as you would find them in Webster's dictionary, but as they're generally understood under the Internal Revenue Code. Now, we'll discuss a little bit later, there are other definitions you might need to be aware of. For example, the Lobbying Disclosure Act has slightly different requirements and definitions on what constitutes lobbying. We'll get to that a little later. But for right now, please keep in mind, we're talking about the tax code, the Internal Revenue Code. So if you are a nonprofit organization that files a Form 990 series return, this is the rules that you need to understand, the definitions you need to understand in order to report this all correctly. So advocacy is when you try to influence a government agency. They've got policies that they set that are not part of the legislative process. And so you want that agency to follow a certain policy or not follow a certain policy. Your efforts to influence them, that's advocacy. Contrast that to lobbying. Lobbying relates to a piece of legislation. You're trying to get that bill through the city council, through the state legislature, through the US Congress. You're trying to get it passed, or you're trying to get it defeated. Your attempts to influence the passage or defeat of that piece of legislation constitutes lobbying. And then the third category is political intervention, it's usually called, and that is trying to get a candidate elected or defeated. Okay, so for our short-term, little shortcut definitions here, for political activity, there has to be a candidate. You want them to win or lose. For lobbying, there has to be a bill or something similar to a bill that you want passed or defeated. For advocacy, there's generally a policy that an administrative department is following. You're trying to influence how they enforce it. Let's drill a little bit deeper into advocacy. It covers the rules, orders, regulations, policies, and similar decisions made by usually members of the executive branch, also such bodies as school boards, zoning boards, the local police department, the sheriff's office. If you're trying to get them to change their policies, that's considered advocacy. Let's look at a couple specific examples here. If there's a climate treaty that the United States is thinking of joining and you're trying to get the president to join or leave. Now, ultimately, that treaty may need to be ratified by the Senate. That would be lobbying. But if you're simply trying to influence the president to take a position on joining or leaving that treaty, that would not be lobbying. That would be advocacy. Likewise, as the US military addresses the use of transgender people serving in the military, your organization may have a position on that. You want them to allow or disallow such individuals to serve in the military, so you're trying to influence the Pentagon to adapt their policies to which you think is most appropriate. That is advocacy. It's not lobbying, it's not political intervention, it's advocacy. And our third example here is your school requires the children to wear a mask all day. Your organization thinks that's a good idea, or perhaps it thinks it's a bad idea, so you are calling upon the local school board, trying to influence them to enforce or change that policy. That is advocacy. There is no limit to how much advocacy any nonprofit organization can do. Whether you are a private foundation, a public charity, a trade association, a business league, a social welfare organization, a labor union, anything, you can do all the advocacy you want. There is no restriction. Under the Internal Revenue Code, you will not jeopardize your tax-exempt status. But you got to know where the boundaries are. At what point am I no longer engaged in advocacy? At what point have I crossed the line and I'm now lobbying? Well, we mentioned earlier that for it to be lobbying, there has to be a piece of legislation on the table. And we're trying to influence the legislature to pass or defeat that piece of legislation. So we need to know what is legislation. There's a pretty wide definition of the term legislation. Let's go ahead and read it. The introduction, amendment, enactment, defeat, or repeal of an act or a bill or a resolution. Okay, that seems pretty obvious. So if the legislature is considering a bill and trying to decide whether to pass it into a law or not, or maybe trying to repeal an existing statute, that's lobbying, because there's a piece of legislation on the table. It also refers to ballot initiatives, referendums. You think about it, under those circumstances, the general public is acting as the legislature, right? It's you and your neighbors voting yes or no on that question. So you are the legislature voting on a piece of legislation. And trying to influence your neighbors which way to vote on that is classified as lobbying. It also covers constitutional amendments, also includes Senate confirmation of treaties and nominees that the executive branch makes. So when the president proposes a nominee for a cabinet position, or say for a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and your organization says, no, that person's terrible. We don't want our senators voting to confirm that nominee. Well, trying to influence your senator to vote either way on that nominee is lobbying. That's a little bit outside the definition of legislation, but it is included under the Internal Revenue Code. There are two kinds of lobbying that we need to concern ourselves with, and you'd be familiar with both of these. First kind, the more obvious kind, is the one I listed second. That's direct lobbying. Direct lobbying is when you directly contact a member of the legislative branch and attempt to influence their vote. We want you to vote yes, or we want you to vote no on House Bill 1234. And you're contacting them directly. That is direct lobbying. Grassroots lobbying, in contrast, is when you try to get your neighbors to call their senator or congresswoman and say, call your senator, tell them to vote no on House Bill 1234. You're not contacting the member of the legislature, but you're trying to influence the people around you to contact their member of the legislature. We've all seen this happen. We've all had it communicated to us. So that grassroots lobbying has to be tracked separately. We mentioned that in some cases, certain organizations will have limitations on how much lobbying they can do. There's different ways to measure that activity. The most common way is, of course, through the money that is spent, the expenditures that are made, but you have to understand this distinction. You've convinced me I'm lobbying, but now I got to figure out, is it direct lobbying or is it grassroots lobbying? Because I track those separately and the limitations are different. So it's very important to work with professional advisors who understand the distinctions between direct and grassroots lobbying. There's a little bit more to the definition of direct. Let's go back to that one. When you are communicating with your members, and your members, we probably need to define who the members are, but we'll do that in a minute. When you're communicating with insiders, that's not considered lobbying at all. That's almost like having an internal conversation just with yourself. And when you urge your members to call the senator, at first you'd say, well, that sounds like grassroots lobbying because I'm telling someone else to take action, but it's not, because your members are part of you, a part of your organization. Telling them to contact the senator is actually direct lobbying. Likewise, when there's a ballot initiative or a referendum, remember we mentioned earlier that the general public is functioning as the legislature. So canvassing your neighborhood and saying, we think you guys should vote no on this referendum question, you'd think that's grassroots, but it's not. It's direct, because you are directly trying to influence members of the legislature. So I put these examples up here to kind of illustrate that what initially maybe sounds like a cut and dry distinction between direct and grassroots does have a couple nuances to it that you really want to be familiar with. Make sure you classify things the right way. There are a couple different ways to measure lobbying expenditures. There is a subjective test. In other words, the organization is saying, we're not doing too much lobbying because it doesn't feel like we're doing too much lobbying. Well, by its very subjectivity, people can come to different conclusions about such things. For example, if I were to tell you that a local nonprofit was spending $2 million a year on lobbying, would that seem substantial to you? Well, many people might say yes. $2 million sounds substantial to me. That's a lot of money to spend on lobbying in 1 year. Another person may say, yeah, but that's $1 billion charity. $2 million is a drop in the bucket to a $1 billion charity. That doesn't seem substantial at all. So obviously, the subjectivity puts you at a little bit of a risk, because what may seem insubstantial to you, to your organization, may not seem insubstantial to someone else, particularly an IRS auditor who's come in and been tasked with examining the lobbying activity of your organization. So there's a little more flexibility here. It's a little more of an art. We measure the amount of lobbying activity by the amount of time the organization spends, by the attention and energy that it consumes. How much of your bandwidth during the day is taken up with lobbying activities? Well, you know, that's sometimes hard to pin down. It includes the efforts of volunteers. People who volunteer for your organization engage in lobbying. have to go into this calculation of the no substantial part test. Many organizations do this because their lobbying activities are so small, they're not in any jeopardy of being subject to any kind of revocation or excise tax or anything like that. So they submit to this subjective test because they have no fear that their lobbying activities are excessive. However, if you don't want that subjectivity, you can file what's called a 501H election and then submit to an objective test. Well, what's objective about this test is that it's mathematical. We don't worry about things like the time and energy and attention and the volunteer efforts. We're simply worried about how much did you spend? What was the cost, direct and indirect, of engaging in that lobbying activity? We also calculate an exact, precise threshold. Based on the size of the organization, there's a mathematical formula. You plug in the size of the organization in one end, and the other end spits out, here's the amount of lobbying you are allowed to do. If you're below that, fine, we move on. If you exceed that, there can be excise taxes that are imposed. If you exceed it repeatedly, and if you exceed it by a lot, not only are there excise taxes, but there is the potential for the organization to have its tax-exempt status revoked. Now, that's true under either test. Problem is, with the no substantial part test, you could get revoked by surprise. You could be, wait a minute, we had no idea this was going to happen. And the IRS could attempt to revoke the organization's exempt status based on this subjective test, whereas the objectivity is less likely to surprise anyone. You can see it coming. You can see that the numbers are much too big based on the limitations that have been calculated. And so the risk is lower because an organization is more in a position to manage it. Let's spend the next few minutes talking about what lobbying is not, okay? We've got some sense of what it is. It's the attempt to get a piece of legislation passed or defeated. There's a lot of things nonprofit organizations can do that at first blush may seem like lobbying or may seem pretty close to the line, and yet if conducted correctly, will not cause the organization to have to track it as a lobbying activity or a lobbying expenditure. So the first thing we're going to talk about is communications regarding executive orders, administrative rules. That's the advocacy, right? Advocacy is not lobbying. So in general, trying to get the executive branch to follow a certain policy or trying to get some government agency to implement or discontinue a policy is not lobbying. Communications regarding stuff that goes on in the judicial branch, court opinions, is also not lobbying. So here's a question for you to think about. Congress has passed a bill, and you are now in communication with the President of the United States over whether they should sign or veto it. Are you lobbying? Well, that's a bit of a trick question, because at first you'd say, no, the President is not a member of the legislative branch. And if I'm not talking to the legislative branch, I don't think it's lobbying. The point is, signing or vetoing a law is part of the legislative process, and the chief executive is acting in a legislative capacity when he decides to sign or veto a piece of legislation. So the attempt to influence him or her one way or the other with such a question is lobbying, not advocacy. Here's another example. Let's say the local police department uses what they call them tasers. You know, they put tasers in their officers' hands, and your organization is against that. We're like, we need to discontinue that. That needs to stop. Well, the police chief has a budget that he submits to the city council, and in that budget, in the past, historically, there has been a line item for tasers, for purchasing them, repairing them, maintaining, whatever it is. And your organization goes and meets with the police chief and says, we want you to take that out of the budget. Well, at first you might say, well, that's not lobbying because the police chief is not a member of the legislature. But the budget that he's preparing is. The budget that he's submitting for review by the city council is a piece of legislation. So such an activity would constitute lobbying. And we said in general, an organization that communicates with the executive branch is engaged in advocacy. not lobbying. But even the Internal Revenue Code has a bit of an exception to that, and that is for social welfare organizations, for labor unions, and for trade associations, otherwise known as 501c4s, 5s, and 6s. Their attempts to influence certain members of the executive branch, and there's a list of who those people are. They're the top cabinet positions, they're the president, the vice president, the heads of certain agencies. An attempt to influence them by a 501c4, 5, and 6 can be considered lobbying under the Internal Revenue Code. Even though if the same thing was done by a 501c3 organization, it would not be lobbying. Now, I've hinted a couple times that the Internal Revenue Code is only one of the set of rules you have to worry about. There are others, the most obvious being the Lobbying Disclosure Act. There are important differences. You may be having a conversation with someone and they say, well, I heard that this was the threshold and I heard this is what we have to include. And you're like, no, I just went to a symposium and the guy sounded like he knew what he was talking about and he said something totally different. Well, you may both be right, because the Internal Revenue Code and the Lobbying Disclosure Act don't align perfectly. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. The Lobbying Disclosure Act only covers federal lobbying, whereas the Internal Revenue Code also addresses state and local lobbying. Another difference is the Lobbying Disclosure Act does not concern itself with grassroots lobbying at all, only concerns itself with direct lobbying, whereas the Internal Revenue Code tracks both. The Lobbying Disclosure Act does include communications with certain covered executive branch officials, whereas generally the Internal Revenue Code only does so for 501c4, 5, and 6 organizations, not for 501c3. There are other differences too about the reporting. When do you have to report? What are the triggers at which you have to report? You need to understand if your organization is engaged in lobbying activities, there's at least these two different frameworks that you have to be in compliance with, because the reporting thresholds, how to report, what to include in those reports is very different. Now, we mentioned a little earlier that communicating with your members is really considered an internal communication. So you can discuss with your members, and what do we mean by the members? We could mean that obviously the members of the board, the employees, the members of any of the chapters of your organization, volunteers, agents, committee members. These are the members of your organization. It does not include, for example, the students at a university, the patients at a hospital, the congregants in a church. Those are not members for purposes of this discussion. The members are really the insiders at the organization. But discussions amongst themselves, even about a piece of legislation, is not considered lobbying. It's considered an internal discussion. Very often those discussions take place through a membership newsletter. And so under the right circumstances, you can send a newsletter to your members talking about all kinds of things that relate to a piece of legislation. And it's not considered lobbying unless there's what we call a call to action. So if you put that little line in there that says, call your congresswoman and tell her to vote no on this bill, now it's lobbying. And if you were paying attention earlier, you'd realize it's not grassroots lobbying, even though that might sound like it. It's actually direct lobbying, because you're telling members of your organization to contact a member of the legislature. Those members are you. So it's as though you are conducting the direct lobbying. So be very aware when you're discussing legislation with your members, there are times when it's not lobbying at all. And there are other times when that call to action is present, where you need to include it as direct lobbying. And again, having a good understanding of who your members are, who's reading these communications, it's very important to being able to make the right inclusion here. Lobbying is not nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. Your organization may be, perhaps should be, writing technical materials about the issues that are important to you. You analyze, you study, and you research how to save the whales, how to shelter the orphans. Whatever your mission is, it's obviously a lot of thought that goes into that. that material may be the subject of legislation. There may be a bill in front of Congress right now to spend more money on saving the whales. Okay, so your research does kind of touch on the piece of legislation. How do I avoid having all the funds that I spend on that lobbying be treated as lobbying just because there's a piece of legislation out there? Well, these are the two tests. One is the content test, which means you got to be fair and balanced, right? You got to present both sides, not just the sides that you agree with and support your position, but a well-rounded analysis of the topic. And second, you can't just give it to people who agree with you. You have to give it to a broad cross-section of the public, a much bigger audience, not just pre-selecting people who are on your side. If you can do those two things, you can meet the content test and the distribution test, you're almost home free. You're almost at the point where you can say, well, everything we spent doing this, we do not have to treat it as lobbying, regardless of the fact that Congress is debating this as we speak. And those two things are, don't put a call to action in there. Don't say anything like, call your senator. And then the second thing is, don't use it next week for a lobbying communication. And the general rule is you got to wait 6 months. You can develop these things, and then for the next 6 months, be very careful not to include them in any kind of lobbying activity. And if you can do that, then your expenses in writing up this research, in conducting this research, does not have to be reported as a lobbying activity. Likewise, the examination of broad social or economic problems. The legislature may be interested in what you have to say on a topic. Members of the legislature may look at you and say, hey, you guys have made a whole career out of this issue. Before I make up my mind how to vote, I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to get some input. And so there are circumstances under which you can share your expertise about this issue without having to track it as a lobbying expenditure. In other words, you're not directly trying to influence whether the bill gets passed or defeated. Let's look at an example of this. Discussions with legislatures, the public, and other interested parties on topics which are the subject of legislation. It must not refer specifically to the legislation and must not include a call to action. Now, how does this sometimes pan out in real life? Well, let's say that your executive director gets called upon to testify in front of a Senate subcommittee. They want to hear from you. The hearing is open to the public maybe, and they want you to come and share your expertise. Are you lobbying? Well, if you're not careful, yes, you are. But if you do it right, then no, you're not. And one of the things you've got to insist on is that the request come in writing. Can't be a phone call or an email. It's got to be in writing. And the other is that the request comes from the body itself and not just from one member. So in other words, Senator so-and-so didn't just invite you to come testify. The whole subcommittee wrote to you and invited you to come testify. And so you are responding to that request. You are going and giving your expertise, and you don't even have to be balanced in that. You can talk about all the reasons we need to save the whales and shelter the orphans. You don't need to give a balanced perspective here, but make sure before you do that, that you have it in writing and that it does come from the entire legislative subgroup that you're testifying in front of. Otherwise, everything that goes into that needs to be tracked as a lobbying expenditure. And our final, what lobbying is not, is self-defense. If there's a bill out there that threatens your very existence, would literally force you to shut down or would cause your exemption to become revoked, you don't just have to sit there and say, well, we're not allowed to get involved. We have to stay out of it, or there are limits to how much we can spend on. No, if it's life or death, you do not have to report it as lobbying, and it is not subject to the limitations that would normally apply. In our last couple of minutes, we'll briefly address political intervention, or what we sometimes call political campaign activity. Basically, you're trying to get a person elected or defeated. And this can include giving them cash. It could include donating services or facilities. It could include coordinating your expenditures with theirs. A couple ways that this comes up, and one of them is giving money to a PAC, giving your organization's funds, financial support to a candidate. The other way that it can come up is ill-advised opinion sharing. And I think we've all seen this on both sides of the political aisle. An individual stand up in front of the audience and basically say, if that person gets elected, it's going to be the end of America as we know it. You know, our way of life is really threatened by that candidate. So vote against them, vote for the other person, they're way better. That's political intervention. And some nonprofits are allowed to do that. Others are forbidden from doing it. So let's try to narrow that down a little bit. 501c3 organizations must not get engaged in any form of political intervention. This applies both to the private foundations, the public charities, the supporting organizations, any of them. If you're exempt under 501c3, stay away from politics. You can get your tax-exempt status revoked. At the very least, you will have to report it on Form 990 Schedule C. It stands out like a sore thumb. Anybody knows if you're filling out Schedule C Part 1B, you've done something you shouldn't have done. Notice these excise taxes, 10% of the expenditure on the organization and 2.5% on the organization's manager who approved the activity. And that's even if you can correct what you did. If you can't correct, or let's put it like this, if you don't correct what you did, the excise tax goes up to 100% of the expenditure, and the tax on the organization manager is 50%. Now that's going to get anyone's attention. So if you do happen to inadvertently get involved with something like this, you're already subject to that first tier of excise taxes and public disclosure on your Form 990 Schedule C. But then you've got to take these corrective steps, and correction generally means trying to get the money back, if that's even possible, and taking steps to make sure that that does not happen again. And then final slide, 501c4, 5, and 6 organizations are allowed to get involved in political activity. However, they can't allow it to become their primary purpose. So it should never be your biggest program or more than 50% of your activities. You want to make sure that even your voter registration, voter drives are done in a nonpartisan way so that you can avoid getting too much political intervention activity into your organization. The other thing is, of course, a 501c4, 5, or 6 can donate money to political activities, but they have to report it on a whole nother tax return, the Form 1120 POL, and pay tax on it at corporate rates, 21%. So whatever you spend on political activities is going to come with a price tag. What a lot of organizations do at this point is they'll set up a PAC, right, a political action committee, and they'll keep all the funds carefully segregated so that if any money comes in earmarked for political purposes, it goes straight into the PAC's funds. By keeping that separate, the PAC then files an 1120 POL. PAC is generally not taxed on political expenditures. So working with the right kind of advisors, knowing what you're doing, there are ways to set that up in a way that will get you the result you want. So hopefully that's been helpful. Kind of understand the distinction between advocacy, lobbying, and political intervention. As we mentioned, there are organizations that can do all of it. There are organizations that can do none of it, and there are organizations that can do some of it some of the time. So know which set of requirements apply to you, and certainly work with a set of advisors that won't steer you wrong. All right, we have now arrived at our break time. We invite everyone to step away for a few minutes, stretch your legs, get a refreshment. We'll reconvene at 3 o'clock Eastern time. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and reconvene our session here. We're going to turn our attention to John Mullins, principal at Mullins PC, and he's going to address the topic remote auditing. Go ahead, John.
Great. Thank you, David. It's nice to be here. I guess we're at the point in our life cycle where we're getting an audit, and in the last year and a half, it's likely that that's a remote audit. So what I'm going to go over is what is a remote audit and what are some ways to make your remote audit successful. So a little bit about us. We were founded in 2015 to provide audit and tax services to small and medium-sized nonprofit organizations. We're a team of 6 experienced nonprofit auditors, 4 of which were hired to be fully remote. So even before the pandemic, our approach was to do as much of the audit work off-site before we went on-site to finish the audit. We do about 125 nonprofit audits annually. And as I mentioned, we always embraced a remote first audit approach. So for us, I think that helped us transition in mid-March of last year to fully remote. And I think we hit maybe different parts of the learning curve earlier than other firms. And I think we're always tweaking our process, but the goal is to set up a remote audit process that works with every nonprofit organization, but also has some similar patterns to help us be consistent and provide a consistent audit with all of our clients. So really, first of all, what is a remote audit? Well, it's an audit where the audit team is not physically present. 5-10 years ago, these probably would have been called box audits, where somebody would have dropped off a box of all their accounting records and you would have done it from your office. But more likely, 5-10 years ago, we were going out on site and spending a week or so out at a client's office. A remote audit is fully generally accepted auditing standards compliant. There are some limited situations where an audit can't be done completely virtually. If you have a significant or material amount of inventory, that inventory actually needs to be physically inspected. So there are times where we do go on site, December 31st, June 30. Those are typically the dates, and count whatever inventory we would need to. Obviously, a remote audit is enabled by technology. I'll touch on some of the technologies that we use, and then obviously, as we know, a remote audit has been required during the pandemic. So I'm going to touch on the old way for a minute. And the funny thing, when we did audits the old way, when we were on site, somehow they always started on a Monday and they always finished on a Friday. No matter if it was a 1-week job, a 2-week job, the jobs were always structured that way. So what would happen is we would arrive at a client Monday morning. We probably wouldn't know a whole lot about the organization's year because we had just finished an audit the previous Friday. So we're finishing that audit. Now we're coming into this audit. So we import the trial balance, we send the testing selections, and then the staff would scramble initially to pull the 40 disbursements, the 40 receipts, the payroll questions, and to provide those to us, because they know in 2 or 3 days we're leaving. We're moving on to the next audit. And funny, as technology evolved, even though we were physically in their office, a lot of times auditors would just email the client staff questions from the conference room. So you're on site, but you're already kind of migrating into this remote scenario. So more often than not, we would email rather than walking down the hall. And then, because audits were scheduled to be back to back to back to back, there'd be large lags of time between when the reviews would work. So the manager would do the first review and then the partner would do the second review. So there were these intense periods of time where we're working very closely with the staff. Then there'd be kind of long silent periods, and then there'd be smaller amounts of time where we would get back engaged in order to complete the job. So what changes in a remote audit? The first thing that changes is the communications process. So So how are we communicating? When are we communicating? And why are we communicating? What also changes is the timing flexibility. So in the previous scenario, when we were on site, you would say, I'm going to be there Monday the 13th, and I'm going to be scheduled there until Friday, and we need to get through as much as we can in that period of time. Now, if there was a problem with the client, or maybe the client was available early, it doesn't matter, that schedule was static. So with a remote audit, it's less scheduled in a way, because we're not physically on site with any clients. And then obviously the use of technology allows productive work wherever and whenever. And the workflow in a remote audit, and we have a slide on this, it's less compressed. It's not compressed like an on-site audit. So generally the work happens over a longer period of time, but the peaks and valleys are not the same. The benefits of a remote audit, and I think the benefits of remote audit go both ways. I mentioned the flexibility. So there's no more rigid scheduling. So like I mentioned, if a client thought they'd be ready on the 15th, and great, they're ready on the 7th, we'll start on the 7th. If the goal was to start on the 15th, but we're a little bit behind, it's much better to be 100% ready than to start when you're not. And so by being remote, it allows that flexibility. Again, the workload compression, to me, this leads to a nonprofit being able to maintain a more normal work routine when an audit is ongoing. So when you have auditors in your office, they are sending you emails, sending you requests. There's a time budget. There's a number of days they need to get in and get out. With a remote audit, it's a longer period of time. So our clients often say, well, I'm going to have a meeting next Monday. I know you're going to be doing the audit. That's fine. We'll schedule time on Tuesday. We'll schedule time another day. There's a lot of work that needs to get done. You don't need to be available for all of it. Additionally, I always thought it was stressful to have auditors camped out in the conference room. And if it took a day longer than expected, what were some of the other staff thinking about the audit and accounting, the accounting and finance team? Did it look bad that we were there for 4 days this year and 3 days last year? And so some of those stresses with having people in their conference room full time. And then I think if you've been audited before, you probably remember the concept of a quick question, where we would just pop into your door, ask if you had a minute for a quick question, knowing that we'd probably be standing there for a half hour or an hour, while you're trapped in your office. So a remote audit allows us to ask questions, and then they're answered in a timely manner based on when you have time, not because we're standing in your doorway. So to me, those are the main benefits of a remote audit. One of the main questions I get asked is, how long does a remote audit take? And there's no great answer here, other than the process is a series, or it's a series of questions that we ask, that when our clients respond, that really dictates what the response time is. This can vary, from a long lag time to very short. It also comes down to the organization of the audit requests. So when we ask questions or request documents, how organized and easy is it for us to understand what you've uploaded and what question it's answering? And then lastly, just the availability to resolve issues. So sometimes questions aren't easily answered over email, and being available as those questions come up is very important. For us, the best thing to think about when getting a remote audit started is to be 100% ready. So sometimes if you start later but you're 100% ready, the whole process can actually be shorter than if you started earlier, but maybe there was 2 or 3 things that you were still ironing out. For us, I think a highly motivated and organized client from start to finish. And when I say start to finish, I mean when we get the trial balance to when we have a solid draft of the initial financial statements, can be about 2 to 3 weeks. This slide goes over the workflow that I was talking about. So the blue line is the on-site, and this is just just an example, but the blue line assumes maybe 2 or 3 people are on-site working on this audit. So they're there, they're putting in a lot of hours, and you can see that it ramps up quickly, it ramps down quickly. There's a period of time where there's no activity, then the manager gets involved, the manager of the team goes back to the client, and then finally the partner gets involved. And so there's a kind of a couple areas where there's some flurries of activity. When you contrast that to the red line, which is the remote line, you can see that it's much smoother. So essentially the remote auditor is working behind the scenes to process all the documents, go through the documents, and then the process is designed so that when we're asking the first set of questions, you're responding to those while we're moving on to the next set. So and then ideally, when we're done with the next set, we'll have another round of questions, but we don't have the same peaks and valleys because we're not trying to finish the audit in 5 days. That's not the goal. We don't have the same physical limitations of being on site specific days. And I think if you look at this, I've talked about the workflow and maintaining a more normal week. I think if you've ever been audited, that red line indicates that there's a lot of time in a day on top of that time. So that's what we're indicating is we're not having the same peaks and valleys that often occur with an on-site audit. So here is the quick poll. Is your organization required to have an audit? Yes, annually, no, just a review, or not at all. I'll give you a minute to answer that. So we are going to go through some best practices, and I think the best practices go both ways. It's things that an audit firm can do, and it's also things that a nonprofit who's being audited can keep in mind. And this is a process, and everybody's a little bit different. So we try to have a consistent process, but allow some flexibility if people want to do things a little bit differently. So my first recommendation is to be organized when you're sharing documents. So have a structure and be consistent. On the left-hand side, we can see that that's part of our document request. So that's our PBC list. And you can see that with each request, there's a reference code. So those are the codes that we use in our work papers. And so one of the ways that we recommend that our clients send the documents over is using those reference codes. Other ways are just to use each one of the blue sections as its own folder. Or there's a number of ways that it can be sent to us in an organized and clear fashion where we know what we're looking for. I did include a couple examples of some things that can be challenging on our end. The first is assets, documents from Frank, general, liabilities, net assets, revenue, and expenses. So for us, most of those folders seem great and we'll know exactly what's in them. But a folder like documents from Frank, are those assets? Are those liabilities? So something like that is inconsistent with the folder structure, and it actually does cause us a little bit of headache. And our goal here is really to understand which files have been uploaded, what do we have, what do we don't have, so that we're not asking questions and annoying our clients when we have information that we think we don't have. Similarly, sometimes this happens, similar folder structure is the first scenario, but then there'll be a folder for new stuff. And again, now we're searching in new stuff and then assets. So for us to have a structure and be consistent is key. The last example is just the general data dump, where a client will push over to us 100, 200, 300 files. And again, it's hard for us to go through that and really understand what's been sent to us, what has not, and put it in an organized manner and then go through the audit efficiently. So I'd say the first recommendation is just to be really careful in how you're organizing those documents when you send them to an auditor. The next recommendation I would have is to focus on the communication strategies. And so one of the things that we do is we send a document request about a month before year end, and probably 2 or 3 months before an audit would occur. Our document request, or PBC list, is both the audit and 990 request. So we send everything at once. We don't necessarily need it all at the same time. So if 990 requests aren't available when we start the audit, that's fine. We discuss the document request at the planning meeting. We also establish scheduling targets well in advance of the audit work. So when are the files going to be uploaded? When do you expect initial drafts? When do you expect drafts for the audit committee and the board? And that sets our timing. The last part of this is to really use that document request. So for us, it's an Excel file, but to turn it into a collaborative tool. And by that, I mean, the client will often put in who's responsible for collecting which document. So if there's multiple people involved, sometimes an executive director might be board minute budget agreements. There's an accountant, and it's kind of obvious what they're gonna provide. But it is important that there's some structure and some collaboration there. Oftentimes, we'll be invited to a QuickBooks Online account, and if that's the case, a client might just put in QBO, and then that's my cue that when they're ready to get started, we will pull that out of QuickBooks Online. Another thing that we do is we establish audit check-ins, and what we're doing here is when we expect the audit to start, we'll schedule a handful of 30-minute meetings normally, just to reserve time on the calendar. There's a lot of questions that can get answered over email, but a lot of them can't. So knowing that I've got a question on Tuesday, but I know on Friday morning we have this check-in, I might just hold it, or I might say, hey, let's just be prepared to talk about this. So by holding time, it allows both sides to be available, and it does accelerate the completion process. And even if there's nothing to discuss, the meeting can be 5 minutes. And a lot of times we've found that these types of meetings have almost replaced kind of the casual conversations you'd have when you were on site. And so these meetings, increase the likelihood that they might say, oh, hey, by the way, we're starting a new program, or we got this grant, or hey, we're not renewing our lease. What should we think about? So as auditors, all those things, we're listening, we're gathering that information. Some of it actually can be important to the disclosures. So by having these, we call them check-ins, it increases the communication, and I think it leads to a better audit. One of the things that we also do is we try to limit the number of emails that we've sent in an audit. So I know when we first started doing this, I might send an email with questions on cash, an email with questions on accounts receivable, an email with questions on prepaid expenses. But then after you go through that entire exercise, you kind of lose track of those emails. So we started coming at this from a more structured approach, where we have essentially 6 sets of emails that we send. The first is the preliminary analytical review, which is questions about year-to-year variances or ratios. And then we ask that those responses are attached to that email or within the Excel file that we send. We also do kind of an inventory of the document request. So we're looking at what we've received versus what we haven't. And then at the beginning of the audit process, we are assessing, do we not have something? Is it not applicable? Are you working on it? Or do we have it and we just don't realize we have it? It's named something that we're not recognizing. And then we also have work paper inquiries, testing questions, and then financial statement questions. And they're not necessarily all in that order. 990 questions are usually last. But by keeping this organized, I think we're increasing the likelihood that our clients are answering the questions how we want them to. And in terms of responding to those questions, for us, it's very helpful if they are in line. So you reply, then you go down below and you answer the question. Our preference is that you respond. A client would respond when all the responses are fully in. It can get a little cumbersome if 3 of the 10 questions are answered, and then a week later 2 of the remaining one, and then so we're still kind of tracking where everything is. But sometimes that's necessary, and that's fine. But our preference would be, it's better to wait a little bit and get complete responses than to be, sorting through multiple emails that contain the responses. Something we started doing in the last year or so would be sending an audit questionnaire. And the audit questionnaire, and this is on the next slide, David. The audit questionnaire is it's a tailored set of questions that we ask to each client. A lot of the questions for all of our clients are the same, but it's tailored because if you're a membership organization, there's going to be questions about your members. There's going to be questions about dues years. If it's a school, we'll have tuition questions, student questions, maybe facility questions. So we tailor this questionnaire and we send it to all our clients right when the audit is beginning. And so it's kind of like that form you go to the doctor's office and you check all the boxes, yes or no. And when you go in to see the doctor, that's just a summary of kind of where to start. I would say ours is very similar, except it's tailored. So we know what questions to ask which clients. And so for us, what this does, because there is limited face time, and that's in quotes face time, this allows the conversation to focus on the substantive issues of the audit. So when we are talking, we're not going through these 100 questions in person, which are obvious yes or no questions. We get the responses from the questionnaire, and then we know where to focus those initial questions. Like I said, we send this at the planning stage. It does help us assess our audit approach, and we do tailor our procedures based on this. And from what I have heard, the questionnaire takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. But then it does really reduce the time when we're together that we're going over those those annual routine questions that are typically obviously no. So the next slide is just some of the technology that we use. I know Michael from Get Suitless talked about the e-signatures. We use DocuSign for engagement letters, representation letters, some tax forms. Bill.com for us has been a great auditing tool. I think they've really exploded in the last year, but they were kind of ramping up pre-pandemic. What's great for us as auditors is we'll get a guest login. We'll be able to log in and test those disbursements ourselves. So I would say probably the time saving during an audit of our clients, not having to pull those files for us and scan them is probably worth the cost of Bill.com for the year. We also use Calendly when we're setting up all of our planning meetings. It's a great tool to efficiently schedule meetings. And then our audit questionnaire does come through Qualtrics, and it's a great system. It's got great reporting on our end. Obviously, QuickBooks Online, Teams, Zoom, Xero, all of those we're also using as well. But the ones I talked about a little bit, I think have really helped us recently. So I know I jumped through that pretty quickly. Just want to thank everybody for their time, and I'm hoping that if you are having a remote audit, that some of these best practices and tips and tricks will help you have a smooth audit.
Thank you, John. That was really excellent. Very, very useful information. And don't forget, audience members, put your questions in the question box, and we will deal with them as soon as we reach the roundtable portion of the discussion. We've saved one of my favorite speakers, Ron Barrett. I've heard him speak many times on the subject of state registrations, and I know he's going to have some very useful information for us. Ron, go ahead.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that introduction. We've attended many a conference at the Greater Washington Society of CPAs over the years, so it's been good to see you speak too. And thank you, John, for that great talk. I really learned a lot about remote audits. So today I'll be talking about state charitable solicitation registrations. If you could just go to the next slide, David, I appreciate it. Just a quick overview of some of the major topics we'll cover is just the registration and a little bit about exemptions. for some charities and certain segments in the market, what states are doing and others are doing to simplify the effort or simplify the process in terms of what amount of effort needs to go into this, especially if you're soliciting in multiple states and registering and renewing in multiple states. And then the impact, this is a very popular section, the impact of digital and online fundraising on registration, and then close it out with charitable renewals and the consequences of non-compliance. So just start with some basic frequently asked questions. What is charitable solicitation registration? So basically, if a charity is soliciting donations for a charitable purpose, most states have a charitable solicitation statute that requires registration, disclosure requirements, and other compliance and ongoing renewals. So that's basically what we're talking about here. Not all states require it. So when you talk about a multi-state registration, some people mistakenly think that you need to register in all 50 states if you're soliciting nationwide. That's not the case. Why is registration required? Generally, because it's the law in most states. That's really the driver for most charities is that they want to come into compliance with fundraising laws. And so that's why it's required. The states look at it from a consumer protection perspective. They are looking at it, and in some states it's within a consumer protection office under the Secretary of State or the Attorney General's office. But that's if you look at it from the perspective of why it's required from the state's perspective, it's just that they want to protect their donors and their constituents in their states. When should registration occur? With the exception of California, registration should occur prior to solicitation. California says that you have 30 days to register after receiving $1 in donation. So in California, you don't have to register right away, but in most states, it should occur prior to soliciting. And who must register? Obviously charities in most states, but there are registration requirements for others as well. For example, 501c4s that are soliciting for, say, a limited charitable purpose that is related to their mission will need to register in most states. Similarly, for-profits such as professional fundraisers or fundraising council will need to register as well in most states. Where is registration required? In terms of at the state level, in terms of the office, I had mentioned the Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office. It's typically one of those two offices or an office underneath a division within those offices, like a charities bureau or a charities section is where it's required. But in terms of the number of states, typically it's required in up to 38 states. It can be high as 42 states, depending on the type of organization. But if you're soliciting nationwide, you usually see registration in up to about 38 states. And how is this different from corporate registration and compliance? And this is an important thing to consider. Some charities mistakenly think that corporate qualification or corporate filings are required in addition to, or mistakenly think that that's what's required when you're soliciting. And that's not the case. And that's to the benefit of charities, because if the only nexus or contact with the state is solicitation, say by email or phone calls or letters into a state, most states are not going to consider that conducting business in a state, and so therefore don't require registration as a corporation, a foreign qualification filing, as we call it in our industry, but rather a solicitation registration. So the emphasis should be on not on registration, the word registration, but more so on what type of registration. Is it to register to conduct business because you have, for example, employees there, contracts, or a sufficient business nexus within a state's register, versus you're just soliciting donors in that state. Next slide, David, thank you. This map just depicts where registration is typically required. The green states, you can solicit to your heart's content. There is no registration requirement. The light blue states have limited registration requirements that is not applicable to most organizations. In Arizona, for example, only veterans organizations need to register. And in Texas, In addition to veterans organizations, public safety and law enforcement organizations need to register. In Louisiana, you only need to register if you use the services of a professional solicitor, professional fundraiser in that state. So if you don't in that state, then registration is not required. In Missouri, oddly enough, they exempt all 501c3 organizations. All that's required there is a one-time email with a copy of your IRS determination letter attached, and Missouri will exempt all 501c3 organizations, so that's good news. It's the red states that you need to worry about in terms of registration if you're soliciting in these states. If there isn't an applicable exemption, then registration is required. Next slide, David. So exemptions, I'm not going to talk briefly about them because there's so many and they vary greatly from state to state. But in most states, they're industry-based, such as hospitals, schools, colleges, universities, educational foundations, houses of worship, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, etc. And then sometimes religious institutions that are either controlled or operated by religious organizations. There are also monetary threshold exemptions in some states. For example, in New York, there is a state-specific $25,000 threshold. And what that means is that if you are soliciting in New York State, you need not register there until donors contribute more than $25,000 to your organization. And when I say donors, it can be individuals, corporations, government agencies, grants, basically anyone that is giving money to your organization in New York as a result of solicitation activity. If it exceeds $25,000 total from all of those donors, then you need to register in New York. Other states do have monetary threshold exemptions, and they vary. They're all over the map. I think the highest is 50,000 in Connecticut, but they're not state specific the way that New York is. And what I mean by that is that they consider donations from all sources from all states. So if you're soliciting in Maryland and DC, Virginia, and New York, and the total amount of donations exceeds 50,000, and you start soliciting in Connecticut, because your donations or contributions have already exceeded 50,000 from all sources, you need to register in Connecticut. So some folks think that those dollar threshold exemptions are applicable per state or by the state or state specific, and that's not the case. So just be careful when you look at those. There's several other types of exemptions, but I won't go into that just in the interest of time. So some of the efforts to simplify, historically, the unified registration statement, when it first came out in the 90s, was a bit of a godsend. It made filing in multiple states much easier. The concept was that you would use the URS, the Unified Registration Statement. You'd fill out the one form and attach the required supporting documents like the Articles of Incorporation or bylaws or IRS determination letter, fundraising contracts that you might have, and financials like the 990 or audit if applicable. And that you would file that package in multiple states that accept the URS. The problem with the URS, though, is in the years since it came out, is that one, the guidelines that go with it have not been updated since 2014. So if you follow those guidelines in using the URS, all filings will be rejected. None of the states will accept your filing because it's so outdated. So I usually warn folks to be very careful if you're going to use the URS. You really have to know what the state-specific requirements are. Another shortcoming is that in the decades since the URS came out, many states have gone to online filing and have preferred that to a paper filing, and therefore have eliminated the URS as a filing option. And then another shortcoming of the URS is that it's just, aside from the rejection and the online filings, the states would require additional filings on top of the URS, state-specific addendums, like Minnesota has a URS addendum that is required. And so you end up from state to state still having different requirements, even though you have a somewhat unified process. Several of the states have additional filings that are required, and if you're not aware of those filings, again, it leads to rejection. So caution when using the URS. Another effort to simplify the process is just the fact that states are moving to online filing systems, which generally tend to be easier. Unfortunately, there's no single filing portal that brings it all together, although there have been attempts to create one. There was an initiative called the Single Portal. It's a multi-registration and filing portal that they've been working on for more than a decade. And when GuideStar and NASCO, the National Association of State Charities Officials, got involved, I thought that it would really take off and that it would that we would see some movement with this. But in 2018, after the first couple of states that came onto the portal, nothing has happened really since. Now, of course, we've had a pandemic that has interrupted the process, but additional states have developed and invested a lot of money in their online filing system, their own online filing systems. And so I think overall there's been quite a bit of resistance from some of the states to get onto the portal. There have been some funding issues with it. And so I wouldn't hold your breath if you're waiting for this to get simple. Unfortunately, each state's going to have their own filing requirements, their own forms, their own online filing platforms. But it is something that I monitor closely, and I'll report any updates on it when available. So a quick poll question: does your organization deal with multi-state charity registration? Yes, annually, somewhat, depends on the activities. No, only at home, or not at all. If you could please submit your answer. Okay, thank you. So oftentimes I am asked, how can we limit our registration? Some organizations might solicit just in a few states, some might solicit nationwide, but there are strategies you can take to limit or limit the number of registrations, or to maximize the number of states in which you can solicit legally while not registering. First and foremost, you should register in the state that your charity is domiciled, if in fact there's a registration requirement. As you saw from the map earlier in the presentation, not all states require it. If you're in a tri-state area, for example, I'm in Washington, D.C., I live in Maryland, and I know charities that solicit in Maryland, Delaware, D.C., Virginia, and they'll register in DC and Virginia if they're domiciled in Maryland because they have events there or lots of donors nearby. Or maybe they'll register in Florida because a lot of their donors are snowbirds and go down to Florida. So we see that scenario as well. So you might think about just your home state and neighboring states where you have a lot of activities or events, or maybe officers or directors live and they're soliciting on your behalf. As I mentioned earlier, Missouri, it's a one-time email. If you have donors there, you can take care of that pretty easily. And then you have the states that might not be applicable, that have limited registration requirements or no registration requirements at all. You add all those together with the addition of a few neighboring states, you've covered about close to 20 states. So you've already covered a good portion of the U.S. just there with limited registration requirements. Beyond that, strategies to look at might include focusing on where the money is and where the donors are. So where are the large population centers, like you think of states like New York or Illinois or California that do have a registration requirement, or Texas that doesn't. But anyway, you might think about where, do a quick analysis of where your donors are in terms of numbers and in terms of dollars, and then maybe register in those states. One thing though you do want to do is temper a lack of registration with considering the embarrassment factor. So, and what I mean by that is that a charity's reputation is arguably its greatest asset. You don't want to be the subject of a news article or a state press release relating to not complying with charitable solicitation statutes. That's a very bad situation to be in. Fortunately, the enforcement profile is not very high, but we do sometimes see volunteers, officers, directors that might live in other states, maybe who are well-known, maybe they're politicians, maybe they're celebrities. And so you might consider registering in states where they're going to be active to kind of not only to protect your organization, but to protect their reputation as well. The last thing I would mention about strategies to limit is what I call the Drive 55 strategy. And what that entails is the fact that, well, first of all, I don't drive 55. When I drove to DC today, I was doing 65 most of the way. And what I mean by that is that my tolerance for risk is such that I realize I'm breaking the law when driving 65 as opposed to 55. And as that relates to fundraising, you might say, okay, well, I solicit very minimally in Alaska and North Dakota. It's very de minimis. I have a couple of donors, maybe a couple of emails. I'm just going to decide not to register in those states simply because it is so de minimis. Yes, technically, if you are soliciting in those states and an exemption is not applicable, you are breaking the law, but the risks are low, and some people might be willing to take that risk. So similar to my risk tolerance for slightly speeding, some organizations might have a risk tolerance for not registering in a state where they have a very minimal fundraising footprint. So it's a strategy you can take. I'm certainly not encourage you to break the law, but we see charities do that all the time. In other words, focus more on where the dollars are and the donors are, as opposed to registering in a state that has a very minimal amount of funds. So digital fundraising, its impact on registration. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. Some organizations might say you need to register nationwide if you have a Donate Now button or you're conducting online fundraising. Some say you don't have to register in any. Those answers are both wrong. Typically, it's somewhere in the middle. Those are the black and white answers, and the reality is that we live in a gray world. And so it really kind of depends on a variety of factors, what you're actually doing, how you're soliciting, who you're soliciting, if you're even soliciting. Unfortunately, most states don't address this topic directly in their statutes because they were written so many decades ago. The internet only came out in the late 90s or actually in the late 80s and became popular in the 90s. And unfortunately, most states didn't update their rules or statutes. However, a few did, and among them are Colorado, Florida, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And they took it head on and used the Charleston principles as, or at least in Colorado, Mississippi, and Tennessee, they used the Charleston principles to guide them with respect to how they amended their rules. And the Charleston principles are a guidance document that were created by the National Association of State Charities Officials and the National Association of Attorneys General. And so these state officials got together in Charleston, South Carolina, created an 18-page document that provides guidance on when and where you need to register as a result of online or digital fundraising. And what it basically boils down to is that if you're using your website in an interactive way and you're targeting or directing solicitations towards people such that they go directly to your website to make a donation, then you do in fact need to register. And so what I mean by that is, for example, say in a newsletter that you're sending out to potential donors or friends of the organization, or even sometimes members of the organization, and you say something like, please go to our website to make a donation, and it goes to your Donate Now website, that's going to trigger a need to register pretty much everywhere that newsletter is received in any state that it's received. However, if the message is something more along the lines, to learn more about our organization, go to our website, and it goes to the homepage, and not to your Donate Now page or to a place where there's an interactive donate feature, that is not going to be classified typically as a solicitation. The person may then navigate over to your Donate Now page and then make a donation. So it really depends on how you're communicating and if you're using your website to target specific people in specific states. Say like you're targeting potential donors in Minnesota and you're sending it to them and you're saying, go to our website to make a donation, that's going to trigger registration. Another major aspect to the Charleston principles is that they basically say that Absent any other type of solicitation, so say you're not emailing or calling or sending out letters to potential donors in a state, but you just have a digital fundraising, an online fundraising presence. What the Charleston Principle says is that if those donations are substantial or repeated and ongoing, either one, and they give examples, substantial being $25,000 in donations and repeated and ongoing being 50 or more donations. If either of those thresholds are hit, then you would want to register in a state. They give those as examples, though. They don't have the effect of law in the states that follow the Charleston Principles, other than in Colorado, Mississippi, and Tennessee. But absent any other document to go by, and given the fact that the Charleston Principles were created by the state charities officials, you can use it as a form of guidance. The state certainly is using it as a form of guidance, and so you can use that as guidance as well. Now, unlike the monetary dollar thresholds that are not state specific in most states, as it relates to online fundraising, it is state specific. So for example, in Colorado, Mississippi, and Tennessee, they define specifically what that amount is, and it is 25,000. But the repeated and ongoing thresholds in those states are, it's 25 in one of the states, I can't remember which one, it's 50 in another, and it's 100 in a third. And so they varied it there in terms of their definition of what is repeated and ongoing. And so what this creates is a system where you kind of got to monitor where your donations are coming from, both the number and the amount, such, and what I mean by that is the online donations, such that when you do start getting to those numbers in terms of the number of donations and the dollar amount in a state, it may trigger a need to register. And so that's why I said maybe it might be required, because it really depends on the amount and the dollar thresholds and how you're soliciting. Next slide, David. Some additional questions to consider relating to online fundraising is, do email marketing campaigns require state charitable registration when the physical address associated with the email is unknown? Then the answer is no, because if you don't know where the email is going and you don't know where the donor is, then you don't know where you need to register. The thing you have to be careful with here, though, is that when they're making a donation, you're likely going to be collecting information, and among that information could be their address. And once you have that, you might add that to your donor data set and then solicit in the future. Since you don't want to lose that donor if they're giving now, you certainly want to follow up with them in the future. That can then trigger a need to register in a state, because you either know or should have reasonably known where you were soliciting at that point. So initially it's no, but it can lead to a yes, depending on if you do find out where those donors are. How do social media, viral, and mobile fundraising impact the need to register? This is a bit of the Wild West, and none of the states are really addressing it, other than what I already mentioned about the Charleston Principles in Colorado, Mississippi, and Tennessee. So you would need to know where the donors are to know where you need to register. And so it's not going to require you to register, but it could lead to that being required in the future. If a nonprofit is receiving unsolicited donations from out of state, that is, it is not actively soliciting in those states, does that trigger a need for state charitable solicitation registration? No, because the donation was not solicited. If somebody just finds you and makes a donation online, it's not going to trigger a need to register. Now, you want to monitor, as I said before, the number and the dollar amount, but it could lead to a registration requirement. If a nonprofit uses a fundraising service that acts as a portal or platform to direct public donations to charities, which of these organizations is required to register? It really depends, and I'll have to come back to that answer in the future, or we could address it in the roundtable, because I don't want to eat into the next speaker's time. I've got a little bit of time left and just a couple more slides to cover. Next slide, David. So compliance. If you do register, note that you need to renew those registrations. I always say it's better to never to have registered than to register and not renew, because the enforcement and the penalties and the fines can add up very quickly in states where you've registered but failed to renew. In terms of renewal due dates, it's all over the map. Most states track when the 990 is due, and they allow for extensions on the state level. So the dates can kind of be pushed out all over the calendar. If there are additional questions on this, I'll address that also in the roundtable section. Failing to register, most states are not real high on enforcement. Florida is one of the states that is. They issue fines and open administrative proceedings quite frequently. Most states, however, do not have a high enforcement profile. Really, what the states are more concerned about is weeding out bad apples, organizations that are fraudulently fundraising. And so that's where the real teeth is in terms of the AGs and the charities officials in terms of their enforcement. If they do find that a charity is soliciting in their state, typically it just generates a notice, a letter saying, we understand you're soliciting in our state, please register if that's the case, and there's no negative consequences to your organization. Next slide. I'm the author of this book, full disclosure, but it's a great guide. It's updated every 6 months. Nonprofit fundraising registration, no list 50 state digital guide. There's a promo code on here if anyone is interested in that book. Next slide. We have created Cogency Global, which is a nationwide registered agent company. We help charities file corporate formations and qualifications and charitable registrations, exemptions, and renewals, and sales tax exemption filings, among other things for nonprofits. But one of the things we've created is a wizard for colleges, educational foundations, hospitals, and houses of worship, where they can quickly answer a few questions and determine not only where do they need to register, but where they qualify for exemptions. So if you're one of these types of organizations, I encourage you to take a look at CREW. And thank you very much. It looks like I went maybe a minute over my time. And David, the next speaker, I believe, is up unless we have another poll question. And we do.
Thank you, Ron. Very, very useful information. While you guys are answering this poll question, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that there are 2 handouts that are available to you. We invite you to download the PDF entitled Nonprofit Finance Forum, which is the entire slide deck that you've been looking at. And then the other is the program materials, which is a effective description of this session, primarily for NASBA CPE purposes. Our next speaker is Patty Brickett, the founder of Brickett Consulting. Patty is my go-to person for all questions international. So she'll be speaking about international opportunities and challenges. Take it away, Patty.
Good afternoon, David. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to all the attendees for making it this long into the afternoon. Just to give you a quick overview, Brickett Consulting is a boutique firm that specializes in working with nonprofit organizations and mobile employees. We specialize in employees, U.S. employees who work overseas and foreign nationals who work in the U.S., but we also work on state issues. As you probably can imagine, these have become very hot buttons with COVID. So let's talk a little bit about, do you know where your employees are working? Are they working from, next slide, David, please. Are they working from your office? Are they working from home, a vacation spot, another state? Are they working outside of the US? And how long have they been there? These are critical questions. And as you can imagine, when we started into the lockdown in March of 2020, we all thought we were going to be back in our office location within a couple months. Now, a year plus later, 18, 19, 20 months, many of us are still working from home, and many of your employees are still working from a location that may not be where you expect them to be. Why is this important to you? As I explain here, this is important to an organization to know where your employees are working and to have policies in place, because anytime an employee is providing services for your organization in what I'm calling a new location, they may be creating obligations for the organization related to the new the new location. The obligations may be registration, audit or tax compliance, property tax filings, payroll registration, and all the payroll withholding obligations for the employee and the employer's cost of the employer portion of any type of tax. Let's use an example. These are the calls I get all the time. You're a DC-based nonprofit. You have a key employee who changed their mailing address from Virginia to California, but they did not actually change their state withholding. Now, we're going to focus on the employer, meaning the organization's responsibility. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about where the employee should file their tax return, but we're going to talk about your responsibility as an employer. Okay, your employee handbook says that the employee needs to notify payroll if they change their state, that they're supposed to submit a new state W-4. It also makes the employees responsible for paying their own state income tax, right? Everyone's working remotely. You haven't seen anyone. So the question always comes up, should I ask employees about these changes? And the answer is yes, okay? Next slide, David, please. You should be asking, but before you do it, I'd like to change the location from what if they moved to California to what if the address change was to Nairobi, Kenya. And then let's look at some of the differences. On the next slide, I've shown the general rules. Employers are required to withhold and remit income and payroll taxes for employees throughout the world. This is true in the US from a federal level, it's true from a state level, and it's true as a general rule around the globe. So the fact that you have an employee who has self-selected to relocate to Germany and has been working there for the last 18 months does not relieve you as the employer from your obligation to withhold and remit income and payroll taxes for the employee. Now, here's an example using Kenya. And I use Kenya because Kenya has a pretty much of a flat tax rate of 30%, which is somewhat staggering if you think about it. But an individual who's making $100,000 gross would pay approximately $30,000 in Kenyan tax, okay? If the employer does not withhold those taxes and remit them, there can be penalties and interest on the unremitted taxes as well as the taxes being owed. The second fact that folks tend to forget is that employers cannot contractually make an employee responsible for paying the foreign taxes that the employer was required to withhold. I hear all the time that my clients have said, go ahead, you can work in Peru, you can work in South Africa, you can work in Malaysia, but we're going to allow you to make that move as a remote worker, and we're going to stipulate that you have to pay those taxes. Just like in the US, most foreign countries will not let an employer contractually make an employee responsible for payment of taxes. If it's an employer obligation, it remains an employer obligation. So when an employee moves to a foreign location, just as when they move to California, there are organization costs which increase. There's the registration costs. There's always questions of whether the foreign country will even recognize your nonprofit status and what hoops you have to jump through in order to obtain that. So the registration of your organization in a foreign country not only may be much more time consuming and expensive, but it may be a very different process than what you expect to register in California. You may be able to register in California by pressing a couple buttons and completing some quick forms. To register in a foreign country, you may need to have a team of lawyers and accountants prepare documents and submit the forms, just like you would submit a form to be recognized as a nonprofit organization in the US. In addition, if you're required to register in a foreign country, there are often statutory audits and tax filings required. The statutory audits often require you to keep quote unquote books and records in the foreign currency. You may have an employer requirement to contribute to a country pension fund, a foreign country pension fund, and that requirement may be a higher pension contribution than you can imagine. There's payroll taxes that are also paid by the employer. There's questions about whether the employee has a valid work authorization. And then what's coming up now is people, my clients are calling and saying, I just found out I have an employee who's been working in South Africa. They've been there since March of 2020. So now the question becomes, what do you do to correct the situation for the past, or do you? And what do you do moving forward? What steps do you take? When do you register? When do you start paying taxes? And each one of these steps is, as I said, they're expensive, they're time consuming. And what's the organization's risk? Oh, sorry, about the buts. So one of the things my clients always say is, but I didn't know they were working overseas in a foreign country. Lack of knowledge has never been a good defense if a foreign jurisdiction assesses tax against an employee and an employer. Lack of knowledge is not a defense in the US, and it's not a defense in most foreign countries. One of the buts is always, my employee is invisible. They're never going to be caught, so why should I even look at this situation? I'm just going to stick my head in the sand and pretend they're not there. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ron's previous presentation because he brought up a very good point. He talked about assessing the risk on a state-by-state basis for registration, charitable registrations. One of the things you're going to want to do is assess the risk country by country on an employee-by-employee basis. And let's talk about that a little. If you have an intern who's working in Peru and they're a casual laborer and they make a total of $10,000 a year because they're not salaried, they don't receive benefits, etc. Your risk may be much lower than if you have a senior executive who was working for you here in the US who decided to relocate to Canada because they really enjoyed the Canadian coastline or they always wanted to live in Vancouver. The facts will be that the individual who relocated to Canada may be crossing the border frequently to come into the US for meetings. They may be asked questions by the border control, where the intern in Peru may never leave the country. So one of the things when you start talking about my employee is invisible, I'm not advocating that you not correct every situation or at least evaluate every situation, but you should put together some type of matrix and evaluate the number of employees, where your employees are, the number of employees in each location, and how much money they're making. Because one thing that I cannot say enough times is not only are the states in the US looking for tax dollars based on state income taxes and residency issues, but foreign countries are. And if you think this is just a small thing, New York State made $1 billion or collected $1 billion in New York State taxes in the last couple of years by what they call residency audits. They're auditing where people are paying their taxes, where your employees are paying their taxes. Are they residents of New York or are they residents of another state and where they should be paying their taxes? Foreign jurisdictions are in the same position that beginning in about 2008, 2009 and the economic crisis, they started to look outside of their own tax collection process to some of the nonprofit organizations that they had never approached or never looked to for tax dollars. And they have become very aggressive. This has only been exacerbated by the fact that, as we all know, during the last year, most governments, our government as well as foreign governments, have spent a considerable amount of money on COVID remediation, on the vaccines, on all of the steps that are involved in trying to protect their population from COVID. And so collecting taxes is a foremost, first on a lot of foreign countries' list. And where they're looking to collect these taxes is often individuals who are not natives of that country, but who are living in that country and not paying taxes. The handbook, as we said before, says employees are responsible for paying their own tax. You cannot contractually make someone responsible for paying for withholding if you should have withheld. But the treaty, there is a misunderstanding that there is a treaty that will always exempt a nonprofit from withholding tax obligations. The treaties are very specific. They tend not to be in many of the countries. We don't have treaties with a lot of countries where your employees may be living or working now. And you cannot rely on the treaty if the individual's there generally more than 183 days. And then my favorite one is that no one pays tax in that country. We talked a little bit, Ron talked about what I'm going to call reputational risk. No organization wants their donors to see them on the front pages of a foreign newspaper as evading local tax law. So the buts are very convenient, but I shouldn't do this because, but the reality is that there's a lot of risk in not at least evaluating. And let's talk a little bit about those risks, where your employees are. Oops. Before we go on, let's everybody who's made it this far answer the quick poll. And this is just a quick question about when you're going to return to a traditional office, or if you are going to work remotely forever. And I would encourage everyone to take a minute and answer it so that you can get your full CPE credit. So now to talk a little bit about the risk. There's unexpected financial costs for the organization now or in the future if you fail to withhold, if you fail to report and remit taxes in a foreign jurisdiction. When a foreign country identifies there's an individual in that country that should have had withholding, they're going to look to you as the employer. So this is a actual cost, and I've seen organizations receive tax bills in the millions and millions of dollars. If you think, well, I've got a good excuse, I might be able to dispute that tax bill, you have to remember that disputing a foreign tax bill could actually take you 5 or 10 years, and there will be significant costs associated with that dispute. And you may do a cost-benefit analysis and decide it's not worth it. Audit disclosure. Do you have an audit every year in the US? Are you not required to identify risk and reserve for that risk in your audit? So you need to make sure if you have this risk on an international basis that you've identified it, evaluated it, and reserved it. We talked a little bit about the reputational risk, and then the employee relationship risk. No employee has ever said, oh, I have $30,000 sitting in a bank account, and I would be more than happy to take that $30,000 and pay those Kenyan taxes that you should have withheld from me, and that I don't know that I now owe. Employers find it virtually impossible to go back to an employee if there is a back tax issue and collect any part of the back taxes. And so what I see happen again and again and again is the employer was responsible for withholding. It's an employee individual tax, but the employer ends up paying the tax, paying for any type of interest or penalties, and basically paying for the vendors who have to do any type of negotiations or discussions with the foreign tax authorities. So what's the solution? Okay, the solution, unfortunately, is not an easy solution. Okay, the solution involves your organization and many different pieces of the organization. It involves HR, it involves legal, it involves payroll, it involves project personnel. David, want to hop ahead to 2 slides? One more, please. Yep. So the solution is, oh, back one, David. Thank you. The solution is to have a policy related to working remotely into a location where the organization does not have an office where the individual is going to go in. The policy requires, as I said, multiple folks, whether it's HR and payroll, whether it's legal, and whether it's project personnel, to be involved. Most of the time, what I hear from my clients are, we evaluated the employee's performance, and we decided that the employee is a good performer, therefore they can work anywhere. What they do not think about is the fair and consistent evaluation, including the cost of having an employee work anywhere. As I said, the cost to add an employee to your payroll in California, maybe it's $1,000, maybe it's $2,000 or $3,000. But the cost to add an employee, put an employee on Kenyan payroll, will be multiples of adding an employee in California. And the evaluation should be fair and consistent, but it should take into account those additional costs that the organization will have, the additional tax costs, payroll costs. There's a lot of different taxes that are charged to an employer outside the US that we're not familiar with in the US. And all those should be included in this cost-benefit analysis. And any kind of policy is only as good as the employee compliance. We'd all agree that a policy is just some words on a piece of paper unless the employees comply. So best practices would say that in order to put a policy in place with regards to remote work and who will be allowed to work remotely and where, that there needs to be some type of audit or review of change of address, of expense reports, of time coding, etc., so that the employees are kept, I'm going to say, on the straight and the narrow, and more importantly, so the organizational risk is protected. David? So be prepared to be surprised, okay? Once you go through the steps of evaluating what your policy is going to be, how you're going to fairly and consistently apply it, what cost you're going to include, so that you do not have any surprises from an organization cost perspective, and you start communicating with your employees, you should be prepared to be surprised. In the last 18 months, my clients have been shocked at countries where they never thought their employees would move to work have become kind of hotspots for folks. Everybody isn't on the beach in Mexico. Everybody's not in Canada skiing. People have gone to what I would call remote locations and have been there for very long periods of time. Anyone who has questions, please feel free. You can ask them in the next session, or please feel free to send them to me at pb@Brookett Consulting. And thank you again for your time. And one more quick reminder is quick poll. I think this is the last or the second to last question. So you do want to answer it to get your CPE. And it's just talking about how many employees or local nationals your organization has working outside of the US. Thank you again.
All right, we'll give everyone just a minute to respond to that poll question, then we'll invite all our presenters back on our virtual stage. We have received quite a few questions from the audience, and so we invite everyone to stay and participate in our roundtable discussion. Our first question is for Alicia. Alicia, the question that came in is, what range of values do you think is typical for an indirect cost rate?
Well, historically I see around 25 and 60–70%. There's obviously other organizations that are, it's not very common that I see rates that are below 20%. I've worked with city and county of San Francisco, and they had well above 100% in indirect cost rates. So it's all relative to the organization.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is kind of a comment for Jeff. I want to see how you respond to this. It says, in a membership organization, our board is made up of members. And your suggestion won't work. It's not possible to find legal, accounting, and investment experts. So how would you address finding the needed expertise in an organization that draws its board exclusively from the ranks of its members? We can't hear you, Jeff. You might be muted.
Sorry about that. I forgot to unmute. Yeah, so it's a great question. And the organizations have to kind of step back and think about their membership. And once again, it may not make sense for, certain organizations, and depending on what they are. But, once again, I'm both an attorney and a CPA. And so once again, you may have people in your organization that may have become physical therapists after other, jobs as being a CPA and decided that wasn't their career, and they're out there. Other organizations I've worked with have actually said, no, we actually, for their audit committee, they actually have a subcommittee of experts that they actually, once again, this one where they actually use a stipend, so they don't pay the people, but they basically say, you spend a year on our audit committee or two, we donate $1,000 or $2,000 to a charity of your choice, so it doesn't come to you, but you get to pick the charity the money goes to. And they have an audit committee, and I know of a couple 501c6s that is their model. They have 2-3 people with audit expertise, auditors of Big 4 or Big 8 at the time, accounting firms. I'll date myself by saying Big 8, but people that serve as along with the actual members from the board, that is the actual committee, but they're consultants to the committee. So once again, you just have to step back and think about it and say, once again, we may have members that have expertise beyond just this, what our membership is made of. So it's doable.
Good. Thank you, Jeff. And I can remember the Big 6. I'm too young to remember the Big 8. The next two questions are on the lobbying presentation. I'll answer the first one, but then I might invite comments from the other panelists on the other one. The first question is the distinction between grassroots lobbying and direct lobbying to be factored in when trying to comply with the Lobbying Disclosure Act or with IRS requirements in meeting the no substantial part test? I think that's a great question. First of all, the Lobbying Disclosure Act does not concern itself with grassroots lobbying. So of course you want to distinguish between the two because you're going to include your direct and ignore your grassroots. If you're worried about your tax reporting obligations and you are under that no substantial part test, you don't have to distinguish against them between them there because you're going to include both. Both the direct and the grassroots go into the no substantial part test reporting. So you don't have to keep track of which is which. The other question is, can you give particular examples or measures of what meets the no substantial part test? Again, that's the subjective test. How does an organization under the subjective test know or feel that it's maybe doing too much lobbying? Does anybody else on the panel have any insight they want to share on that? I would say that simply measuring the organization's revenue is probably not the way to go about it. And measuring expenditures as a percentage of your expenditures, if you're going to do that, you might as well submit to the objective test. Now, I've had organizations make that election and then revoke the election and make it again and revoke it again, because in a given year, One year they said, look, we want the security of that mathematical test. Tell us how much we can do and we'll stay within that limit. Other years, they knew they were going to exceed that mathematical limit, but they still felt that subjectively it should be okay. So for that year, they revoked the election. Now keep in mind that making the election is retroactive to the beginning of your tax year. Revoking the election is effective the day you revoke it. So you're going to have some complicated calculations if you switch back and forth too many times. But again, a great question. All right, let's see what our next question is. This one is for John. Should remote audits be cheaper than on-site audits?
They certainly can be, especially if we factor in bill.com. That's one of our factors in the fee. We also do look at try to assess how much of their information is already available electronically, and the more that is available electronically, we do take that into account.
All right, good answer. The next question is for Patty, and that is, what if the employee moves and doesn't tell me? You're on mute, Patty.
Sorry. This is where it becomes very important that the organization have a policy in place on employees requesting remote work and telling the employer where that remote work will take place and having an evaluation. The policy needs to be communicated, and it needs to be communicated frequently, because what happens in most cases, and I saw it happen this past May and it's happening again in October, is an employee moved to California where the tax rate is closer to 10%, but they've been having taxes withheld in Virginia at 5%, right? And they call up the employer and they want to blame the employer for not having the higher withholding. So the employer should have a process in place. As I said, there might be some way to review or audit, but it has to be a communicated process that reminds the employees that it's their responsibility not just to change their address, but to notify payroll of the change in tax withholding. Because I'll tell you, it won't just be the 5% additional tax that's due in California. The employee will owe interest and penalties because the tax was not paid during the year, and they will ask the employer to pay those interest and penalties. And so this becomes a very personal question. And employees will not tell you. So you have to have a process in place that encourages them to do so, and it's documented that it's their responsibility. Payroll is a joint responsibility, employer and employee, and it has to be shared.
Hey, David, I'd like to piggyback on that if everyone can hear me. Some of the places, I think that Patty's advice is spot on. And one of the things that we've been seeing is companies including language in an offer letter about updating, if they're a remote employee, updating the company with their address, with their new address. And then, of course, the operational piece on the HR side or payroll side of updating the location, the new location, potentially having new compliance requirements in those states, potentially needing to send out new labor notices and posters for those states, and also including that policy in a handbook as well, which usually gets updated on a more frequent basis and disseminated on a more frequent basis. But we're seeing that as well, where someone will be working from a remote location, not notifying their employee. All of a sudden, the company has an employee in a new state that they didn't know of, and possibly, that employee files for disability or state mandated disability, or files an employment law claim, or whatever it is. And so that's really what you want. It has to be an interactive process, and it has to be an ongoing process.
Yeah. Can I make one other point that I don't think I mentioned? There is a mobile workforce coalition that has been trying to put a very clear 30-day bright line test in place in the states, in the US, since 2006. Legislation has passed, but it's never gotten through both houses. And the theory is that if an individual works in a state for less than 30 days, the employer would not have to withhold in that state. That legislation, as I said, it comes up every congressional term. It gets passed at one level, but it's never gotten all the way through Congress and the Senate. So this will give some relief to employers with regards to individuals who want to go to that beach house for a month. And my understanding is it's probably going to be 90 days in 2021 because of COVID if it passes this year. But there's states who object to that. States like California and New York do not want this passed. They want to collect every tax dollar they can. Just a little addition there.
Okay, thank you. I want to give Ron an opportunity to go back. There was a question on one of his slides that we didn't have time for that I know has come up several times with my clients, and that is, if a nonprofit uses a fundraising service that acts as a portal or platform, I guess here we're talking about things like GoFundMe, to direct public donations to a charity, which of these organizations is required to register for charitable solicitation purposes? Can you address that for a moment for us?
Sure, I'm happy to. It really kind of depends on a couple of factors. The biggest factor is the portal or platform a for-profit or a nonprofit? And the reason I say that is, as an example, Network for Good is a nonprofit organization, and it's a portal. And many thousands of charities use this portal to receive donations. But when a donor makes a donation to a charity via the Network for Good platform, they're actually donating to Network for Good, the charity. And Network for Good is issuing the receipt. And they're acting in a donor advised or donor directed capacity where they're then transferring the funds to the intended recipient, the charity that the donor wanted the funds to go to. But because they set their platform up as a nonprofit, what Network for Good did is they registered nationwide with all of the states that require registration. The states were happy with that initially, but some of the states came back and said, well, wait a second, you're helping other charities. You're a nonprofit, that's great, you're registered, but you're helping other charities to fundraise. So in that capacity, you're also a professional fundraiser or a fundraising counsel at the very minimum based on the definitions in our statutes. And so some of the states came back to them and said, you now need to register as a professional fundraiser or fundraising counsel. And because of that, now all the charities also need to register. And so what happened there is that Network for Good created a for-profit subsidiary that is a professional fundraiser. And that professional fundraiser only works for Network for Good and then registered nationwide as a professional fundraiser. And basically what Network for Good said to the states is, well, we work with a professional fundraiser, it's registered nationwide to solicit, they're not working for any of the charities on our platform. And that passed the smell test, so to speak, for the state regulators. They were happy with that. I think maybe some states like California wasn't entirely pleased. And so, and that's largely because California has drafted legislation for, I think, every year for the past 5 years to address this situation. And they actually have a bill that has passed the lower bodies and is now sitting with the governor, and it's waiting to be passed, that addresses the registration and reporting and disclosure requirements for these platforms, whether they be charities or for-profits. The thing is that if it's a for-profit platform, the registration requirements get much murkier there. There very well could be registration requirements for both the charity and the for-profit platform. It's not addressed directly in the state statutes, though. Those states could make a very good argument that both need to register in that scenario. And I think California, being a leader the way it is in terms of legislation and the other states following, if the governor does in fact sign this into law, I think it's going to have a pretty profound impact on these portals and the charities that use them.
Kind of piggybacking on that a little bit, I want to pose a question for John, and that is, once you register to solicit charitable donations in a state, you often trigger an annual tax filing requirement, and sometimes those tax filing requirements include attaching audited financial statements. What can you tell us about that, John, where you've seen somebody unexpectedly have to get an audit because they were active in a state?
Well, our advice is, if you're going to go over the threshold, go way over the threshold. We do get a lot of calls that Illinois has sent us a notice and they need a review or they need an audit, and it's a bit of a scramble to get that. So yes, that certainly happens for us. From what I've seen, and maybe Ron knows more about this, the states are generally flexible as long as you comply in terms of getting the audit. I haven't seen penalties or interest if you're in the process of complying, but it is a scramble. It is a headache, and unfortunately, it's something that is required.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think we've certainly seen situations where, and just so the audience knows, there's no federal requirement for a nonprofit to have its financial statements audited. The 990 asks you to disclose whether or not they are, so there's some transparency there, but there's no requirement. That is not the case with many of the states. Many of the states do require you to submit audited financial statements once you pass certain thresholds, so you've got to be aware of that. Next question is on Jeff's topic, though again, I think there may be others who want to chime in. Is there any risk of doing too much of a board meeting in quote unquote executive session?
Good question, David. And I'm going to say the answer is yes, because you don't want to spend your entire session in executive session. I mean, that's not the purpose of the executive session. The executive session is to be a recap or something at the end of a meeting or where you're going to do it. So, you know, in my mind, it should be 15 minutes, maybe max kind of perspective. So it doesn't become, so that nobody thinks you're hiding by having an executive session. So, you know, once again, you want to make sure it's part of the meeting, but it's not the meeting. So, yeah, you don't want to make it go too long. But I just want to make one other comment back on your earlier. What I've seen lately now too, some of the state regulators are really looking at your determination letters and checking names and everything. So a lot of people today do have to go to the IRS and get affirmation letters if they change their name over the years and things like that. So people that don't know, you can, if your determination letter doesn't match your current name, you can go out and request an affirmation letter, and they'll resend you so that everything matches up nicely. Or you need to basically send them your new articles if you've changed your name, so they can get everything to tie out.
Well, I appreciated a comment you made during your session about if you should probably automatically go into executive session, because things will come up that people won't volunteer if you give them the choice. On the other hand, if you never go into executive session, then all of a sudden you do, the executives can get really nervous. So if they're kind of used to the fact that, all right, after every board meeting, we have executive session, I have to leave the room for 10 minutes and I come back in, then, you know, it doesn't make them nervous that they've done something wrong. So I think just developing a consistent policy there is very helpful.
And it also includes the executive session with the audit firm when they're presenting the audit, because some people say, well, there's no reason because there was no disagreement. But however, you can use that executive session to ask other questions about succession planning. You don't have to, it can be around audit risk issues other than the audit itself. You can talk in executive session that you maybe, you know, to me, the succession planning is one that never comes up, and that's why it's a good place to talk to the auditor. Now, how strong is the bench, things like that. You can ask other questions not necessarily related specifically to the audited numbers. So even with your auditor and you have no qualms with the audit, you still might want to go into executive session and be prepared to ask other questions. And once again, though, it means your board members need to be prepared to ask questions. They need to prepare for the meeting.
How often, John, do you find that when you're presenting the finalized audited financial statements that the board does ask you to participate in an executive session? Does that happen majority of the time?
I would say 10 to 20% of the time. Not.
What was that all?
It's not routine.
Okay, interesting. All right, the next question is for Patty Brickett's Kenyan hypothetical. I think that was a very interesting and intriguing example for all of us. And the question is, I'm going to kind of summarize it. If the employer's only, let's call it nexus to Kenya, is that single employee is there, and the employer has no other assets in Kenya, what can Kenya really do about it? I mean, it's one thing for New York to say, hey, you owe us taxes and we can kind of reach your assets in the United States, but how could a country in Central Africa do that?
Okay.
You're on mute, Patty.
I'll tell you how this usually comes up, and I'll give you a couple real life examples, okay? A couple leave Brazil, don't pay the taxes. They have a shipment that is supposed to come out of Brazil. They're in the US, their shipment's in Brazil, because there's no tax clearance certificate. In other words, they've never paid taxes, they've never said they were there. Their shipment is stuck in Brazil, and an HR person here in the US gets an urgent call saying, we need our stuff back, we were working down there, et cetera, et cetera. Now, your organization could say that's none of my business. Lots of times the organization says, oh my gosh, what do I need to do to help? Another situation, you've got an individual in South Africa who's there, who's working on a tourist visa, who should be on a work visa, who's not paying tax. All of a sudden, the individual realizes that if for any reason, when she comes and goes, because she comes and goes out of South Africa, they realize she hasn't paid taxes, she will not be allowed a visa into South Africa for 3 to 5 years to work. So she'll be prohibited from working there. What usually happens is, I think I'm going to use Michael's, I think you said, your employee gets hit by a bus. We had an employee in Hong Kong at one point who got had a heart attack. The organization had not registered in Hong Kong. The employee went into the hospital and they said, oh, do you have insurance? Do you know what I mean? The organization, again, had been like, well, take care of your own. And they said, no, I work for this organization. So usually what happens is an employee has a problem. They may get the tax bill, but they reach out to the US. And it really doesn't get to the point of who can reach whose assets. It gets to the point that you have a problem vis-a-vis an employee, and you're either going to pull them out there as fast as you can, or you're somehow going to try and settle that situation. So I've never seen, I understand what the question is, like, well, how do they reach our assets in the US? I've never seen it get to that point. I have seen organizations deal with the issue on an individual by individual basis, and I'll tell you, probably 95% of the time, the organization pays the tax. For all the reasons we talked about, reputational risk, et cetera, because they have other operations in Kenya, or they want to go into Kenya with a certain donor, et cetera, et cetera. And donors no longer are very happy, is my understanding, with organizations that are flaunting the global tax rules. It's really considered unacceptable these days. At one time, donors seemed to put up with it, but my understanding is some of the large non-governmental donors have said enough is enough. We need you to be compliant. So hopefully that provides some answer, although I don't think it's answered the question.
Yeah. The last question, I think, is designed to get me in trouble, but we're gonna discuss it anyway. The person asked, is there a risk to one's exempt status if one were to advocate or lobby for policies that are anathema to the public policy of the United States? And I guess my answer would be, what's good public policy to people on one side of the political aisle is bad public policy to people on the other side of the political aisle. And I would suggest that just taking a political policy position, advocating for something that is not the majority opinion. I think the example was the vaccine mandates or the mask policies. No, an organization is not likely, as of today, I don't know about next month, but as of today, probably would not get its exempt status questioned or revoked for taking those policy positions. However, it was pointed out after the events of January 6th that organizations, nonprofits that were determined to be supportive of events that could be deemed an insurrection could potentially have their tax exempt status revoked, or at least called into question. They would have some uncomfortable questions to answer. So I think it's obvious that nonprofits cannot advocate for crime, cannot support illegal activities, and that what is a perfectly acceptable policy position today might be a perfectly unacceptable policy position in a few years. I think we've all really marveled at the changes in public policy that have occurred within our lifetimes, and no doubt that will continue to happen. So there is a caution there about nonprofits advocating or lobbying for activities that are too far afield of their mission. If your mission is to save the whales, maybe better stick to that. And if you have opinions about vaccines or masks or anything else, set up a new nonprofit or do it through a nonprofit that's designed to do that kind of thing, because the jeopardizing of one's exempt status is only one of the negative outcomes. The other, I don't know whether you want to call it cancel culture or anything else, but there certainly is a lot of negativity out there in social media, and straying too far from your mission is only going to alienate the people that you want supporting you in your nonprofit activities. So on that note, I think we've reached our conclusion. Thank you so much for sticking with us all the way through this. Please reach out to any of our sponsors. As I mentioned, the handouts are available. Everybody's contact information is in it. These people are all individuals that I've worked with, that I trust, and that will give you good guidance and counsel on the issues you need. So thank you, everybody. That concludes our webinar.
All right.